we'll let it go for 5 minutes. Okay, it's running. I think so. Greg, will you test the mic? Okay, it's good, but you're not coming in over the live stream. Hold on. Okay, hold on 1 second. Test it out one more time here.
Okay, testing 1, 2, 3. AnteDote, June 6th, 2020. Hot times call for cool minds.
All right, good. All right, we can hear you now on the live stream. All right, we'll get going in about 2 minutes here.
That sounds good, guy.
All right, Queen Ale or whatever, Queen G.
Queen G. Oh, God. Oh, God.
Lindsay Blavatnik Graham. Queen G is the least of your problems, blackmail-wise.
A scandal like that is going to completely, at least in the media scope, deflect completely from those questions.
It's true. I'll play the intro music in a minute, Greg.
Okay. We're gonna be
You
live
might not be able
to.
Well, we're live right now, but we'll start our conversation. You're probably not gonna be able to hear the intro music. This is
We're
sort
not
of
actually
like
talking on air, are we?
yeah. It's sort of like in the green room or whatever.
Okay.
But I'm gonna play the intro.
Just let me know when the intro's playing if I can't
Okay, here's the intro, Greg.
We must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
Huh? What happened? I tell you what happens. Where?
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No collusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
No collusion. In my Alec Baldwin playing Trump voice. No collusion.
Welcome to the AnteDote Live. This is Jeremy Roth-Cushel.
And this is Greg McCarran.
And I believe we're live right now. Oh, except I still have the timer up. Sorry, I'll get rid of the timer. All right, there you go. Timer's gone. I don't know exactly about our background here. This is not going to be great, but whatever.
In time, my friend, things will get better and better.
Okay.
Yeah, so you'll, I guess people who are tuning in will see the title for this program here. Hot Times Call for Cool Heads. And I thought that was a great
cool
title.
Minds, cool minds.
Cool minds and cool heads, cool minds. But cool minds, cooler heads. This current moment, I think, requires something like that. And so, the two of us, we, imperfect as we are, we're trying to do the best we can to try and keep our minds cool, allow our cooler heads to be in control of things, which admittedly is not always an easy thing to do, especially at a time like this when there's so much emotion in the current events of this particular moment in our history, in this experiment we call life.
It's true. Things are wild right now. But there's sense to be made. And it's not as simple as just sort of saying, well, everything is a scam or this is all engineered. There's definitely some aspect of that is true, but we have to be able to parse out the details a little bit, especially so that we can see where is the authenticity, where is the genuine moment, and then where do we stand in the mix. And everybody's seemingly never been more triggered and never been more sure that they're in the right camp or whatever at this point.
Yeah, just a simple look at social media and a lot of the talking points going on. You really get the sense that I think we've been politically divided for so long. We've talked about this, but it seems like right now in this moment, the political division over, I'd say first with the COVID-19 and the differing reactions to that. Now with this thrown like a fire right on top of all of that and everything else surrounding Trump administration, we've now got one of the constant themes, at least in our modern history, of, perhaps the most emotional topic, I think, in our modern history. And that, of course, is the topic of race, with race once again at the forefront in terms of at least the media narrative, the way the dynamic that's being created here from a mass media perspective, once again taking the forefront in this. It creates a very, very emotional. So we have a very, very, I would say, emotional based division, and I would say it's as high, perhaps, and I'm thinking likely at a higher level than we've ever seen it, at least in my lifetime, as far as the scope of the division right now. And on a perspective, while there's definitely room for that to change in some areas, especially if we can get, certain points and ideas can be articulated in a manner that I think would actually bring a lot of agreement among people. From a perspective of the way the mainstream narrative, so to speak, is being fomented, it's not easy to see a scenario where this will change anytime in the immediate near future. As a matter of fact, under the trajectory, if we don't, if some logical truth points are not inserted, I think, into the conversation, we're only going to continue to see this division, this very emotion-based response to things, emotion-based reactions, which I think further foment the division. I see it getting worse. So there's a responsibility among some of us who are able to think and it's hard to do in times like this, who are able to think with nuance and in more critical terms than just simply what our emotions how our emotions would allow us to respond. I think there is room to create talking points into these varying narratives that I think can actually be of good, rather than just continued division, which is what I think people in positions of power and influence want, especially at this moment.
Yeah, we were talking. I was on the road back from the spring. I was just thinking too, like there's a cool resource that folks might want to check out. It's called findaspring.com, and it's actually mapping of various springs all around the world, so you can go get your own spring water. And there's really nothing like freshly harvested cold spring water in terms of basically quenching your real deep thirst. So I was on my way back from collecting water from the spring for the family, and we were talking on the phone about emotion. What you were just talking about, this, emotions. What's the role of emotions, and the relationship to mind or thinking, and I began to, it popped in my mind of that thing about Bruce Lee talking about be like water, and I'm gonna play. I've actually pulled it up. I'm gonna play it because it's such an interesting clip. But I was thinking, we were talking about on the way back here, that like that idea that emotions are almost like elemental in a certain way. So, and I was making the argument that we don't want to put them aside per se. We want to let them be their element. We want to actually involve their element into our moment. Oh, cool. Greg, are you sharing Find a Spring?
Yes, I am. I pulled up the
that's
website
cool.
and I'm sharing it, so you can choose a region.
Oh yeah, do that again. It stopped sharing. That was really cool.
Oh, I was scrolling up and down the page.
Oh yeah. Do it. Share your screen again. That was.
Oh, it says I'm sharing it.
Oh, you are?
Yes.
Oh.
At least it says so. I'm gonna pull up locate. I'm just gonna pull up locate a spring right now, and I'm gonna click North America. And I'm gonna click to see where these would be available in the great state of Missouri.
Yes, I have been to one spring in Missouri. Actually, it's like a gold fish pond, or it's an industrial operation. And but we used to go to one down in Arkansas. Actually, it was like a 4.5 hour drive there, 4.5 hour drive back. Get like 50 gallons at a time. Really cool guy named Sonny down there, who his wife was a biochemist, and she would test the water every month, I think. So it was cool. That's a real cool thing. But I'm not seeing the. I wonder if I need to do something to help you be able to share your screen. Are you sharing it now, Greg?
Yes, it says I'm sharing.
All right.
And this is all part of the learning process, folks. Once we master this, we'll be very dangerous.
We're at the moment right now where we're just know just enough to be dangerous.
So you don't see a Google search. You don't see a Google search with Awana Spring written.
Oh, here's what I got to do. Here, hold on one second. Here, I know what I need to do. Okay. I need to go in. I need to share Zoom. No, I am sharing Zoom. And now, are you sharing it in Zoom?
Yes, it says you are screen sharing.
Okay, sorry about this, people. Yeah, I do. I see it in there. Oh yeah. Here it is, right?
Yeah, this looks like this is the.
But we're not seeing it on the live stream for some reason, which is
weird.
Oh, maybe I'm covering it up. I'm covering it up, Greg.
Uh-oh.
It's a cover up.
Now is it showing up?
Yes, it is. I just had it covered up with like our little tags and all this.
We have Arwana's spring here. This is, I guess, it looks like this would be the spring closest to Kansas City, Missouri. A natural spring flowing from the base of a tree in the Missouri River bluffs. Pretty interesting stuff, and I'm glad. It's looks like it's in the state of Missouri, somewhere around Kansas City. I'm not quite able to identify where it's located, but I mean, this is a very neat resource that you've shared with us, Jeremy. And I'm guessing you probably found one in the Lawrence area or close to.
No, it's over next to actually Manhattan, which we thought we should go to like K-State, because who's the president of K-State, by the way, credibly accused 9/11, at least in the know suspect Richard Myers.
Yes.
Wait, don't stop sharing.
Okay.
That's okay.
All right.
Okay. Yeah, just leave that on here for now. That's cool.
Yes, Richard Myers is the president of Kansas State University.
Yes.
One of the people who is influencing our younger minds, and that's always a comforting thought.
Well, it's interesting that the Plum Island facility was basically transferred to Manhattan, Kansas, where they're doing a lot of the agricultural threats study is over in Manhattan, Kansas there. So that, and I think that, it's interesting that it comes along with Myers into the position of president. Remember, Richard Myers is the one who ended up being the acting Joint Chiefs of Staff on September 11th. Multiple stories about where he was and when he knew things, similar to people like Condoleezza Rice, but even worse, I would say. And not even clear where he was when the building that he was basically the acting CEO, really, right, chief of, was blowing up for however reason, it was probably multiple reasons. And of course, this goes to the whole thing about how many people were out of town on September 11th. For example, the actual Joint Chiefs of head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Who was it? Was it Skelton?
I believe it was Skelton. I could check real quick.
So that he was out of town. Remember, lots of the FBI counterterrorism was off the eastern seaboard. Some of them were in Montana, I think. Some were in Northern California and Monterey for different conferences, and then, of course, there's all the drills. But then I've pointed out before that the nuclear bomb squad under the Department of Energy, and remember, of course, this Epstein question about Bill Richardson, the head of the Department of Energy during some key years in the 1990s. That's where the nuclear weapons are under the Department of Energy and not under the Department of Defense. And then, of course, the nuclear weapons lab focused around Bill Richardson's home state, where he was governor of New Mexico, where Epstein himself had his own Zorro Ranch, where some of the weirdest stuff seems to be involved around the eugenics and the potential, mating of the human species, and the kind of really strange stuff that it looks like was in the background of the Epstein operation. But the foreground of the Epstein operation is things like weapons trafficking at some level, in combination with high-level blackmail based on pedophilia.
By the way, the head of the Joint Chiefs on September 11th was General Hugh Shelton, and he was head until September 30th, 2001. And then Richard Myers took his place on October 1st, 2001.
So that's interesting. I believe Colin Powell was also out of. I believe Colin Powell might have even been out of the country, as was that nuclear bomb squad, the NEST, in the Department of Energy. They were out of the country for the first time in 3 years, doing a bomb, undoing a terrorist nuclear device in a European theater with a lot of different aspects of U.S. military, NATO. So, ground zero, people like to say, call me Jeremy Rothschild or whatever for talking about the nuclear component of September 11th. But to me, it's sort of obvious. It's sort of de facto if you look at the actual ground zero phenomenology, and the disappearance of human bodies, and the micronization of massive tons of concrete. But that's besides the point. I was thinking about that. So this idea of emotions being like different kinds of it's sort of dismissive to talk about 9/11 being besides the point, isn't it? I mean, that's what I keep thinking of, like, 9/11 still relevant, still needs to be talked about. We were even talking about this Zev Shalev interesting live stream from last night with Steve Hoffenberg, who was working at Towers Financial with Epstein, and basically looks like he took the fall for Epstein and has been in more recent years working towards apparently some kind of justice in relationship to the victims. And then people like Eric Garland, a sort of intelligence analyst of some sort, and then Lincoln's Bible, who's like a Twitter mob expert. But then, I keep on thinking, like, finally they're sort of getting to this question of how central Israel's role is and was in a lot of this. And then 9/11 sort of comes up, and how are they going to begin to broach the subject there. But all right, Greg, keep me on focus here. I wanted to finish this point. right? About emotions being like elemental
Yeah.
forms at
I
some
would
level.
throw in there real quick that one way perhaps to maybe for some of these people to start looking into the 9/11 aspect of things, and not just even from an Israeli perspective, but even from a global perspective in terms of like a global operation carried out by large, I think a lot of the same people who carried out what happened, the events of what we've called 11/9. I'll just say this real quick: is even there's even little steps you can start taking a little looking into things like what exactly are the details of, I don't know, the Manafort family's construction company being brought in to clean up the World Trade Center steel, little things like that. That Giuliani ends up, I believe, in one of his last acts as mayor, ends up getting all the steel out and sending it, I believe, to China. So there's little questions you can start to ask, possibly maybe push people who might not be so inclined to naturally just go right down the 9/11 conspiracy rabbit hole. Maybe questions like that could be a lead in for possible conversation, or something like the relationship of, say, um, Marcia McLennan and Paul Bremer uh, to the Greenberg family, and Maurice Hank Greenberg being on the board of the Center for the National Interest, the think tank that's all about better terms with Russia. So little cool things like that, possibly.
That's a great point, actually, Greg. In terms of the especially going from 11/9 to 9/11, that's sort of where the moment is right now, and maybe we'll talk some about that. We'll eventually like play the interview between Jason Goodman and Dershowitz, which I believe in some way was put front and center things like Epstein and Israel and Dershowitz denial, and then the scandalous controversy then covered by Alex Jones and Tucker Carlson and about Dershowitz saying that the state had the right to come to your home and grab you
True
and
News
stick
and
a
Rick Wiles
needle.
picked up on it as well, and they're coming at it from even like a more Jewish centric direction, whereas Alex Jones and Tucker Carlson are not. So
And everybody who then covers it forgets to say that the very first thing that they talked about was about Michael Flynn and how
yes,
Russiagate is a nothing burger. So
yeah,
I guess my point is that in the midst of all this, the 11/9 is those people who are focused on it are continuing to be really focused on it, and that this is a really good idea, Greg, to sort of take them back from the 11/9 characters back to the 9/11 characters. And so we will then see Giuliani, and then maybe we can introduce Bernard Kerik into the mix. And where was Bernard Kerik in the weeks leading up to September 11th? And what did Bernard Kerik say about the Israeli intelligence white vans that were arrested surrounding things like the George Washington Bridge and with apparent explosives?
And there are even questions going back to even things like Felix Sater and the Mogilevich crime syndicate in relations to possible relations and connections with aspects of the Bin Laden operation. So there's a lot of ways that this could be dissected. In you think as more details come out and the more you learn, the more ways you realize that an operation like this can be dissected from a lot of different areas, and it's not just for seasoned researchers who have been in the process of exposing, say, scientific anomalies for years. There's other ways you can go about this, and you learn more and more ways to begin to address these matters and also tie them into other issues. So, for if we can credibly come at this, I think, and I think there is a way to insert these topics into areas where there's serious research being done that are not naturally inclined to go down, the conspiracy theory, what they might consider tinfoil hat route on this. Of course, we disagree with that assessment, but there's got to be ways to reach this for people who are not so inclined into these varying perspectives and narratives and the weaponization of the September 11th, conspiracy theories over the years, very much spearheaded by Alex Jones types, We Are Change types, other types, those who are just really blaming, I think, Israel and Jewish people, I think, in a very toxic manner that actually does not increase our level of understanding on things and in fact limits the scope of that. So there's a lot of ways to go about this. And one more thing I want to say before we get you back on track with what we were talking about. Go ahead.
First I'm going to respond to that after you make your point, though. Before I let you get me back on track too.
Okay. Do you want to respond now? Or do you want me to finish?
Finish your point. Sorry.
Okay. I guess the last thing I'll say before we finally get ourselves back on track, and I'll give you the last word on this, is what you mentioned there. Another thing that's really interesting about Dershowitz and Goodman, and we'll talk about this, I think, when we discuss this more in a I think maybe in a long form conversation here in the near future, is that no one from Alan Dershowitz to Jason Goodman to any of these media outlets that covered this, InfoWars, obviously Tucker Carlson wouldn't on Fox News. I don't think True News brought this up either. I don't know if anybody brought this up, is the fact that they all talk about Dershowitz. Like, for example, InfoWars and going after Dershowitz describes him as a as an Epstein attorney, but what did not mention Alan Dershowitz's most recent high-profile defense. Gee, I wonder why.
Exactly.
It's like they want to rewrite history that just happened 6 months ago and act like this never happened with Trump
Yes.
and the impeachment trial. So I just want to throw that in there.
Well, yes, exactly. And so first, I want to just quickly deal with the question of the Mogilevich syndicate in relationship to this background that, tying 11/9 to 9/11. Some people don't like those shorthands, and I understand actually because I've always said that 9/11, even using that nomenclature in a certain way, is meant to dehistoricize it. It's obviously meant to connect it to 911, to an emergency, to our system, our emergency system. But then it also just sort of dehistoricizes it. It turns it into a outside of time or outside of history kind of thing. But, we actually, use that nomenclature when we did our From 9/11 to 11/9 series, because in a certain way we were responding at some level to the Michael Moore, cover up of both Fahrenheit 9/11 and Fahrenheit 11/9.
Indeed.
And it was a good launching point because of we like to look at, okay, what's the continuity here in terms of Michael Moore being the leading documenter of the sort of limited hangout criticism from the other side of the worst of the Bush administration, which was actually that certain elements were involved with September 11th, not that just that Bush, because of his friendship or background with his family and the Carlyle group and the Saudis and all of that, sort of just went golfing too much and was clearing brush and looked the other way. No, it was because, Michael Moore's agent, Ari Emanuel's buddies, their family buddies back in Israeli intelligence were staging it on American soil with the help of Americans that were highest level, very likely, it looks like, in the Bush administration.
Yeah.
And then same thing then to 11/9, no talk of election fraud. A lot of talk about how Trump is talking to the middle of the country and how he could become the new Hitler and all of that, and yet no deep analysis of the Russian-Israeli mind war aspects, nor the election fraud aspects.
Very similar dynamic, if you ask me, of Ari Emanuel. And of course, we know about his brother serving in the Israel Defense Forces before going on to be Obama's chief of staff and then mayor of Chicago, Rahm Emanuel. Ari Emanuel being the mutual agent.
I think he only volunteered or something.
Okay, volunteered.
I'm not sure about that.
But either way, it definitely shows that is at a large level, I would say, an allegiance to a foreign country.
And the dad is Irgun. Yeah, was Irgun.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I would say, though, Ari Emanuel being a mutual agent of both Michael Moore's and Trump's, and Michael Moore comes out first with Fahrenheit 9/11, being the documentary that really cemented, I think, in the public eye, the idea of Bush and the Saudis and the complicity in terms of lack of warnings, and we knew this could happen and we could stop it. Very similar dynamic there, I think, with Ari Emanuel being behind Michael Moore, as say maybe the movie JFK and Oliver Stone and the involvement of Arnon Milchan in terms of perhaps limiting the scope of the JFK assassination inquiry and leaving out a very particular foreign entity in that as well. Of course, that being Israel and the varying Zionist interests that were definitely at play in the events of November 22nd, 1963, just like with 9/11 and Michael Moore. So
that's a great parallel, and it's actually an even more severe example in certain ways in terms of how direct the potential obviousness of the sponsored cover-up is, right? So the question that's not being dealt with in JFK the film, executive produced by Arnon Milchan, longtime agent of the LACOM, basically, of the Bureau of Scientific Relations, is how I think it was started. And so it was sort of started before the real sort of hardcore jumping off of the nuclear age. But then it became really focused on nuclear transfer technology, and that's who Arnon Milchan is, really. He's probably one of the most successful or highest level agents of what I've called Israeli nuclear intelligence, which I think would be completely fair for Milchan, because that's what was definitely involved in, was smuggling trigger Krytrons right from LA, I believe, so nuclear triggering devices. apparently working with Netanyahu about that. And so then that film, the whole piece of the motive of the background of the Kennedy assassins had a lot to do with what was covered in Michael Collins Piper's book Final Judgment, which had to do with, and it's interesting if you go read his book. The introduction to it, he talks about how it became really clear to him what was happening when a lot of these newer books started coming out. I think in the 90s, actually, I think is when he was talking about it, like Seymour Hersh's book about the Samson option, and then Avner Cohen's book, Israel and the Bomb. I think that's what it's called, that had significant pieces in there that talked about the tension or the the pushback by President Kennedy to Ben Gurion on the question of the Israeli nuclear bomb, right? And so that was actually the jump off point for Final Judgment in many ways for Michael Collins Piper, and then he put a lot of the other contextual details together around that missing motive. And so that, of course, is the key missing motive, it looks like in many ways, in the film JFK, executive produced by Arnon Milchan, is this Israeli nuclear question. And there it is, Israeli nuclear intelligence agent Arnon Milchan executive producing it. Okay, so that is so stunning that it's sort of it's a little bit overwhelming, I think, to certain people, because of how could they, how could it be so open? But so then we have to deal with it. And so back to 11/9, you brought up the question of Mogilevich around this. And, I thought that I remembered that the Able Danger document that we covered a little bit in our From 9/11 to 11/9 series talked about the Taiwanchik Trencher organization, which I believe was rounded up, many of them, I mean, at least more than a handful, I think at least like a dozen or maybe a few dozen members of this aspect of Russian organized crime were arrested and prosecuted in around 2013-ish. I think Preet Bharara, probably, when he was with that southern, was he the
I believe the prosecutor for the Southern District of New York.
Yes, yeah, right, exactly. He was the attorney for the Southern District SDNY, and
where Giuliani once was the attorney for, in the takedown of the Italian mafia, basically replacing them with the Soviet arrivals.
Yes, and then apparently also the rise of New York City as basically just a satellite of Israeli intelligence too, and then of course, and that's where those aspects, or Giuliani solidifies that, ends up being in Israel for cyber conferences when he's Trump's cyber security expert advisor, in a similar strain to where Bernard Kerik is in Israel in the weeks leading up to September 11th. And that was also then covered in that Able Danger document that puts Bernard Kerik at the epicenter of the New York aspect of September 11th, and talks about these payments, loans, whatever they may be, by people like Eitan Wertheimer, who's a billionaire Israeli industrialist, family tied into, like, their, we dealt with some of this in that series, but I think it's called, the guy's name is Don Sharon, from the book Talpiot, Israel's Edge. It identifies Don Sharon as having been a key player in the Talpiot program, and Don Sharon is basically the key lieutenant of the Wertheimer family, who run a few different key Israeli industrial companies that deal with things like plane parts. What's his name? Buffett bought it, I think, at some point there. And Wertheimer also was the head of the Jewish Agency for Israel. And the other guy, of course, who then turned out to be the head of the Jewish Agency for Israel, was Natan Sharansky, who we dealt with in terms of these really serious questions that really are not covered almost at all about he was accused of being a long-term Soviet agent, and then sued hardcore and won against one of the guys who was accusing him, and based on apparently personal knowledge back in the Soviet Union when they were all in jail together, and apparently Natan Sharansky was seen by other prisoners as sort of some, working with the guards at some level and having special privileges.
Jeremy, are you seeing the screen, by the way?
Yes, I guess, great.
Okay,
this
is the company Iskar. And there's an article from CNBC, May 4, 2013, of Eitan Wertheimer discussing why he sold the shares of his company to Berkshire Hathaway.
So it's not just Bill Gates; it's also Warren Buffett. So everybody, all of our billionaires involved in Israel.
History in this roundtable that we did on the Secret Right on John Brisson's channel, along with the esteemed researchers Recluse and Neil Sanders of Neil Sanders Mind Control. It was brought up that Warren Buffett's father, much like the father of the Koch brothers, had connections to the John Birch Society. That's very interesting, long-term types of connections that could be, when you think about them, might be much more significant than you would think. But I mean, there's some history there. I don't know how well known that is. I think the Koch brothers are much more well known, but there's also this hidden history with the Buffett family as well.
That's key. That's really good info there. Yeah, so Wertheimer and there's interesting. There's a very recent interview with Bernard Kerik that actually discusses this. What's edutainment? Is that the name? I think it's edutainment. Infotainment, right. And it's interesting, he asks these questions that very few people have ever asked, I think, before. And you can see Kerik get sort of angry or nervous about, and he basically says that he was accused of taking a bribe from Wertheimer. But he says it was just a personal loan that he used that he was paid back or intended to pay back. But that's what Abel Danger allegedly says was a key element of some of the money aspect related to the New York aspect of September 11th. And we also then dealt with in that series and then a little bit later on, I think when we were dealing with the Trump's Ground Zero, and then also about unlucky Larry Silverstein and these real estate guys surrounding the Trump himself, Trump Ground Zero.
It's Valuetainment, Jeremy. Bernard Kerik opens up Valuetainment, January 17th, 2019. So
great, thank you, Greg, for that. And and so and then there was that other there was two different. And it's interesting they didn't touch on the other questionable loan that I think Kerik was actually either under suspicion for or actually got prosecuted for, which came from what's the other real estate developer? You remember we were dealing with
names escaping me right at the moment.
Too.
Vornado, correct? Stephen Roth?
No, Stephen. No, not. I'm trying to find it. I'm looking into the paper. Oh, I found it here. Witkoff, Steve Witkoff.
Steve Witkoff. Okay.
Yes, and specifically this we were reading from, or I was reading from this article debunking the 28 pages top secret 9/11 document revealed by Jeff Smith, and it put forward what they call an FBI Abel Danger classified top secret SC file on 9/11. And it includes Eitan Wertheimer, Jewish agency BOC, and then this $250,000 to Steve Witkoff, to Bernard Kerik's wife, Bernard Kerik, Gambino Crime Syndicate. On the other side, just above that, is then Jewish Agency Board of Governors, is then hooked in with Paul Kurzberg, Israeli Mossad, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Safari Club founder, Turkey bin Faisal al-Saud, Bandar Bush's wife, sister of Omar Bayomi's wife, Osama Baznan's wife, through Riggs Bank, Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Mihdar, Flight 77, BCCI, Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, 9/11 hijackers, and then back down around to the five so-called dancing Israelis, but also Dominique Suter and Ornit Suter, who were running the moving systems. So there. That's an interesting piece there, because there's that whole bottom portion there is the part that like people like John Gold, for example, seem to miss. You know, they'll go all over the 28 pages and the Osama Baznan and Omar Bayoumi and Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Midar and Bandar Bush and Turkey bin Faisal al-Assad, but missing is what apparently FBI, Able Danger itself, says relates directly to the Jewish Agency Board of Governors, right? Which then, you know, we were dealing with Natan Sharansky and that question, and someday we'll there's one reference on the entire internet, as far as I can find, to the question of Abraham Foxman, the former head of the so-called Anti-Defamation League. Now obviously critical in understanding the role of Israel in training our police departments, high-level command staff in the psychology of occupation, of ethno-supremacist occupation, really is part of it, and then bringing that mentality back and basically seeing yourself not as a peacekeeper in the community, but as someone who's keeping the peace over the occupied, in the occupied territories, really. Okay, so there's that aspect. But Abraham Foxman, it's identified in this one document, we'll find that and address that someday, was suspected even by certain elements of the ADL of being what they called what's the name of the program, the long-term Soviet program, the illegals, of being a Soviet illegal, basically a deep agent, like a long-term sleeper, and so that's a sort of interesting question there.
This is may not be directly related, but it's kind of interesting that Rick Sanchez, the former CNN anchor who lost his job after basically pointing out that Jon Stewart is Jewish and actually has a Jewish last name. Name's escaping me at the moment. Leibowitz.
Leibowitz, John Leibowitz.
Yes, he made light of Jon Stewart's last name, and he ended up losing his job at CNN. He proceeds to basically go on an apology tour with Abe Foxman, going to a New York Yankees game and all that. And then Rick Sanchez pops up on RT America as its leading news anchor, basically replacing, I believe, Ed Schultz after he passed away. So that's very interesting as well. I mean,
super interesting, actually. Yeah. All right. So then I just wanted to, in finishing up on this question of 11/9 to 9/11, and in the back of Craig Unger's book, House of Trump, House of Putin, The Untold Story of Donald Trump and the Russian Mafia, he has a list of sort of crucial players he listed as Trump's 59 Russia connections, and then 55 and 56 or 55 is Vadim Trincher, along with Alimsan Takunov, Anatoly Golubchik, and Hillel Namad. Trincher was a leader of two Russian-American organized crime families, the Taiwanchik Trincher Organization and the Namad Trincher Organization, which ran, quote, international sports books, unquote, that laundered more than $100 million out of the former Soviet Union. They operated out of the 63rd floor of Trump Tower until they were busted in 2013. Okay, I'm going to read the next input here, but also I wanted to say that in the article about this Able Danger, I think it's called Mapping 9/11. It's about Fort Lee, published on Veterans Today, where it talks about this Taiwanchik Trincher organization having been rolled up in 2013. It says that they actually played a role on September 11th in relationship to things like the communications jamming. And in that article, it identifies the Fort Lee, which is right over across the Hudson Bay, I think, from Manhattan into New Jersey there, as a long-term mob town that over time, similarly in relationship to, like, in a similar fashion to Giuliani and the Italian mob, shifting it over to the Jewish-Russian mob, that it was there was a shift over there, and it was a key mob town in the area, and it was there was these, I think it's 3 high-rise buildings, basically condos, high-rise condos, that they call Ginza on the Hudson, really, and saying that they were actually the staging grounds for some of the signals intelligence, what you might actually call it, signals intelligence warfare aspect, or the communications warfare aspect, or counter communications warfare of September 11th. So that whole story about the Giuliani bought these bad Motorola devices No, that's a cover story. It looks like, according to this allegation, and that they were actually jammed via the Jinsa, via Jinsa on the Hudson, and the staging of certain assets and places. And so you can see that very likely Israeli intelligence was sort of the fixed point, you would say, the sort of fixed point controller of the operation, but they were using assets very likely on the ground, such as Jinsa on the Hudson elements, and then also this Tywinchik trencher organized crime element. And then, so finally, finishing up here, number 56 is Alimsan Taiwanchik Toktakunov. Another ringleader of the Taiwanchik trencher organization, Toktakunov, has allegedly spent more than 3 decades working with Mogilevich in the Sotsanevo organization, dating back to the early 80s, when he hung out with Mogilevich and Mikhailov at the legendary Hotel Sovietsky in the Moscow suburb of Solntsevo. He was indicted for conspiring to fix the ice skating competition at the 2002 Winter Olympics. After the bust of the gambling ring in Trump Tower in April 2013, he surfaced in November at the Miss Universe pageant in Moscow near Donald Trump. But poor Donald Trump, he was just being taken advantage this whole time by all these bad guys, dude.
Or was he simply learning from his father and Roy Cohn and all these people how the New World Order works, and was secretly plotting to bring them down all these years? Inquiring minds want to know.
There you go. That's actually more plausible.
Well,
I mean, it's not plausible, but it's potentially internally coherent that he's hiding himself as a crypto patriot all of these years, rather than somehow he didn't know any of this was going on.
All right, so real quick before we finally go back over to our initial point, I wanted to bring up one more thing. It's kind of a full circle. This whole dynamic of what we talked about with Ari Emanuel, Michael Moore, Arnon Milhan, Oliver Stone becomes even that much more interesting when you consider the fact that Oliver Stone over the last decade or so has been a hardcore defender of all things Russia and Putin, along with also a critic of Israel, getting out there on things like the Stephen Colbert show that it was Israeli American Jews interfered in the presidential election in 2016, not Russians. And then Oliver Stone, circa 2010 or so, even dabbling in Holocaust revisionism with his this article here, as you can see here, from July of 2010, Jewish control of the media is preventing free Holocaust debate. Outspoken Hollywood director says new film aims to put Adolf Hitler, who he has called an easy scapegoat in the past, in his due historical context. So this is very interesting when you consider Oliver Stone being brought into this with Arnon Milhan and that connection, basically covering up JFK and the Israel aspect of things, with Oliver Stone's basically being a Russophile, you call him, to a large extent. And then also the relationship of Arnon Milhan with his closest friend in Hollywood, that being Andy Vajna, the late director of, or involved with films like Rambo, as well as, I believe, Last Action Hero with Arnold Schwarzenegger, among other films. And Vajna's central role in helping the very both pro-Putin and pro-Netanyahu Viktor Orban consolidate the media in Hungary, all the while then the questions that we talked about in the past of the possibility of Viktor Orban being blackmailed by an aspect of possibly by the Semyon Mogilevich syndicate. So that's another full circle. Just that makes it that much more interesting, is some of the things Oliver Stone's done over the years, and also being involved with this extended network of people who work on a global scale, but ultimately with the big film that he made, which was his claim to fame in terms of the conspiracy realm, that being a central movie, it appears in a long-term limited cover-up aspect of the Kennedy assassination, and the primary, or very, I think, central role at the very least that you have to put into context with the other aspects that were covered in the film and in other places that are also well documented and need to be fully figured out, but leaving out a very important part of this whole operation, which was the Israeli Zionist factors you talked about before. So
wow, it's so interesting, because then what pops in my mind is, so wait, Andy Vanya did Rambo? What was it?
He was in, no, he didn't. I don't think he made, okay, let me find, no, because it's good to get the facts straight on this.
Yeah.
Andrew Vajna was the producer of the Rambo film. Yes.
interesting because it reminds me of the whole like what from our show on Monday about Minneapolis and the Gurmazian family, the Persian Jewish family who developed like the world's largest shopping malls. 9/11 researchers are aware of Frank Lowy, the Loeys, and their key role they helped. Lowy was actually involved with Larry Silverstein
Oh, and
in.
correction, it was Total Recall, the Schwarzenegger film that he produced, not Last
Let me
Action
get this.
Hero.
Let me get this out of the way so you can be seen here. Let's see. Sorry. And so what's resonating in my mind is that this Gurmazian family, which owns the Mall on the Americas, that has been in the site of certain scares, but also then was handed over to Israeli intelligence veteran Michael Rosen and his group in Minneapolis. That their family, first of all, Mall of the Americas, then the American Dream, I think, is the name of their mall in New Jersey. So it's sort of interesting that Arnon Milchan, Israeli nuclear agent, supreme, as closest associate, friend from Hollywood, Andy Vanya, is producing all of these sort of great American movies, and so that there's something to that of like selling the Americanness to the Americans by really by these Israeli agents.
Yeah, and Rambo, I would say, was probably, I mean, I wasn't around in the 80s, but I've seen the films and I know what the films represent, at least the first three. And very much in the 80s, in addition to being like a pop culture classics, they're also very much molded the minds of Americans as far as like military and the post-Vietnam War, with the first film of Rambo being the vagabond who was the persecuted Vietnam veteran who was looked at as a baby killer and all this and that. And then the second two movies where he goes back into service in over in Southeast Asia and in Afghanistan respectively to go fight the evil Soviets and save his left behind brothers while also dealing with the corruption within the bureaucracy, so to speak. So it's very interesting that someone like Andy Vajda would be so involved with those films in terms of what you were just talking about there. And one more thing I will remind people about is the what we dug up from Variety magazine in January 1991, where Arnon Milchan mentions Andy Vajna as his closest friend in Hollywood and feeling like a bit of an outcast in Hollywood, which is pretty interesting because when you consider this whole foreign aspect of things, and he considers himself an outlaw in Hollywood. It's pretty darn interesting.
And it's interesting because, like, it's pretty clear Milchan is an Israeli. He's an Israeli, first of all.
Oh, and it's also
he's an Israeli intelligence agent. But Vanya is not. It's more complicated with him. There's a much be this Hungary connection, and so it's hard to tell exactly if it's just Israeli with him.
I think it seems to be more global in this aspect of things. I really do. And interesting, one more thing I never noticed in this article at first was Arnon Milchan, a confirmed Europhile. That's very interesting as well in that article, in addition to being obviously an Israeli agent. But I think the global questions become more interesting when you take in the possibility of what we reported from Hungarian sources of the question of Viktor Orban transitioning from a typical centrist European politician into more of like a far right defender and developing the close relationships respectively with Putin and Netanyahu, and also being at the epicenter of this larger anti-Soros operation, which is really the creation of what we've identified before, Arthur Finkelstein and George Birnbaum. And so that question, and then the questions of the Mogilevich syndicate and possible the shifting of Orban from centrist European politician to far right friend of the other, the other extremist far right governments globally. So it's very interesting. I mean, I do think there's a global aspect to this, but in the narrow perspective of so much of the alt media, people only focus on Israel and leave a lot of other things out that I think are just as crucial to trying to get a bigger picture understanding of a lot of these things. So.
Yeah, I mean, and that background of the apparent flip of Orban is really compelling in terms of explanatory power, and then also this question of in those articles, the Budapest Bridge, but Hungary as a locus at the epicenter of the 11/9 operation, and that apparently in terms of like that area of Europe, it is the hub of Russian intelligence operations. Similarly, like the Netherlands, and I believe actually the airport I think it's in Amsterdam. I think is what sort of notorious as the hub of Israeli intelligence operations in Europe. And then just go look at the background, of course, of all these different, some of these sort of big terrorist controversies of the post 9/11 era. A lot seem to emanate in some way or touch in with the Mossad's headquarters in Europe in Amsterdam. But similarly, in that the Russian intelligence is running their operations out of out of uh, Hungary, I believe. I believe that's a notorious fact. I mean, I may be wrong. Maybe it's a close by country, but I believe that's the case. So that's interesting. And so then dealing with Milchan too. There's so much interesting stuff eventually that we'll have to get into in the book about him, Confidential by Meyer Duran and Joseph Gelman. And we've touched on stuff in some of our antidotes about how supposedly he gets in the game in relationship to, I think, someone from DuPont who he just sort of meets on the plane. Okay, go for it, Greg.
And also from a perspective of a long-term Soviet element of this, if we consider the belief by some, and it looks like there's evidence to back this up, of a lot of the opposition to Israel that rose up, particularly in the Arab world in the during the Cold War era. The relationship is basically artificial opposition that was never actually designed to become powerful enough to actually really affect Israel in any serious manner throughout the Cold War. You think about the relationship that we had delved into a little bit in a previous show, I believe, between Arnon Milchan and Yasser Arafat, the longtime head of the Palestine Liberation Organization, and their apparent fondness for each other, and Arafat enjoying Arnon Milchan films, particularly Pretty Woman with Julia Roberts and Richard Gere. So there's an aspect there that will also be worth diving into. And so
definitely, and I was also thinking then too when you brought up the connection to about RT and then Putin and it's interesting that and then you're pointing out Oliver Stone and the sort of Holocaust dog whistling or whatever, that it's interesting recognizing the way that that Russian centric horseshoe of sort of in relationship to the Semitic, as it's called, right? Sort of, is it anti-Semitic or is it quote unquote philo-Semitic, right? And they play both angles of that so obviously, and
right,
and so.
Jeremy, I think I'm gonna have to take off for just a minute and check on something. If you want to, continue on and then maybe bring us back to where we were originally going with. I know you had a Bruce Lee clip, so I'm gonna let you go on for a couple minutes. I just gotta run and check something.
Okay. All right. Okay. Good luck, Greg. So yeah, so this, that thing about Putin, it was sort of soon thereafter, after the 2016 election, and Putin being sort of quoted about, and maybe it wasn't immediately after, but it was like a year or a year to 2 years afterwards, as Russiagate was heating up, and Putin being quoted as the people who were involved in it, in terms of the quote unquote Russians who were involved in the Trump conspiracy or whatever, the election meddling or whatever. He's like, they weren't Russians, they were Jews. They weren't Russian, ethnic Russians, they were Jewish Russians or something like that. And so it was interesting, and that got a lot of play in the sort of like David Duke circles, those kind of circles. And I can't remember where True News was in terms of their sort of move on the horseshoe from, Rick Wiles. But I think that was an interesting moment there, sort of displaying how even Putin himself obviously can play both sides of the sort of Semitic horseshoe, whether he's whistling anti-Semitic. Those aren't real Russians, really. They're not ethnic Russians. I mean, meanwhile, of course, like, it wasn't just Jewish Russians. It was also like, the GRU officers in the GRU. They weren't all Jewish. There were, it was the Russian government that was obviously involved at some level in this. So it's interesting. So Putin can sort of whistle that side of it, but then he can also be one of the close, being seen as like the closest Russian leader ever to the Jewish community and the best for Chabad, and all of that stuff. His deep background in sort of being seen as philo-Semitic and in the way that that's understood, and so that is such a telling horseshoe even from Putin himself. So it's interesting, Greg, that you noticed that.
Yes,
I don't. Oh, you're back.
Off.
Are you okay?
Yes, I'm back. I had to take off for a second. Yes, I think things look like they're okay. I just had to go check something out that was going on, but I'm back now. So
okay, good. Okay, very good. Or okay, I was gonna. Oh, should I play the? Should I just finish up that original thought about emotions? And
see, this is the good thing about going longer is it gives us more time to live streams and long forms. Is we want to crank out more of these, and because we consider obviously we very much value and appreciate Alan Reeves and the No Lies Radio platform. But we do like to delve into these longer form conversations where we can talk more free flow and then have time to transition back around to things, because that's one of the things that we can do with these we can't do with our regular 58-minute kind of news summary of like current event show. So I'm glad to be able to do this in longer form so we can go off for 45 minutes to an hour and then finally get back to the original point at hand. And so
exactly.
Let's maybe get back to that, and then we could have then we can transition over into another conversation. So
yeah, and I was just talking. I don't know if you heard most of that, but I was just talking about that moment with Putin, talking about the sort of this horseshoe of the sort of surrounding the Semitic, of the anti-Semitic to the philo-Semitic in the Russian sphere, especially in the media, but also even Putin, of that moment where he was saying it wasn't Russians, basically ethnic Russians, who tinkered in the election. It was Jews. And that got a lot of play, like with some of the sort of, anti-Zionist, even maybe anti-Jewish, power, alt media and all of that. And the David Dukes, and see, he's sticking it to him. And yet, meanwhile, he's, deep in bed with the Chabad Jewish community and his even personal background, and obviously the relations with Israel and technology and all of that. So it sort of shows that was a really sort of frontal example of the way that they play that horseshoe, like their own, sort of. So we have the Wurlitzer, right? The great Wurlitzer over here in terms of the CIA, and so maybe they have the great horseshoe over there in Russia. Maybe
it operates like a Wurlitzer.
Fork.
It operates the same way. It operates very similarly, but nonetheless, just different dynamics. And maybe
I sort of imagine it's like a ringing bell. It's sort of like a ringing bell that they ring different parts of it for different people to hear.
But also at the highest levels, it seems that there is a large coming together, like what we documented with, it seems, the biological warfare propaganda in the current moment, as we talked about in our own show on Robert Cadlick, and also in our recent Whitney Webb interviews. There's a lot of definitely overlap at higher levels.
Okay, so back to emotions, that they are like elemental forces of some sort. And so obviously something about air and fire are the elements of this moment, right? Even if you think about the alleged originating event in terms of the kneeling on the neck, which is apparently, a technique that is very often involved in relationship to Israeli occupation forces in terms of Palestine, but of Chauvin, the chauvinists. It's interesting, the Proud Boys. I just sort of ran into that thing of when Alex Jones was jumped into the Proud Boys, and it talks about how you're a proud Western chauvinist. Not a proud Western patriot, right? That'd be one thing, but a chauvinist, like you think you're better than, like
we're going to beat you up until you can name all 5 breakfast cereals. But there's darker forces at play than just like with that type of video that you think is kind of innocent looking, but I mean, there's definitely bigger forces at play with that type of. It seems to be innocent propaganda when you just watch it. I mean.
Yeah, and so obviously, this question of air being cut off when someone's knee is on your neck, that's air is part, and sort of that sort of the the you know, think about what that emotion is, the sort of the maybe the terror related to the cutting off of oxygen or the gasping for air. There is some aspect related to air, because of course you don't have food, you don't have water, you can last, days at least, and you can last a month, more than a month without food, very, very possibly. You can last days without water, but you can last barely minutes without air. And so air is this sort of elemental. So there's something about the air, silence, right? Saying a name, the I can't breathe. So the air is in the mix there, and whatever whatever that sort of feeling surrounding air, and it not being available maybe, is in the mix. But then of course fire, right? Sort of all the iconic pictures of the looting and the buildings on fire, or as we've seen, almost like an archetype, as if it were set up in every single city, of that there needs to be a police SUV or a police cruiser on fire, right? The fire. Fire, fire, yeah, sort of like it plays on that element. So those are emotions, right? So then related to fire is obviously anger, sort of rage, it's in that element, and I was just sort of making the case when we were talking, Greg, on my way back from the spring, that their emotions, we should not allow them to overwhelm our thinking or our potential wisdom, but we should let them sort of maybe wash through like water in the environment, and I think about like a lot of this from my background with permaculture and landscaping and things about how you use water, how you work with water, because of course here in Kansas, like we have these storms sometimes that brings down, it's not like monsoon season like in Southeast Asia where it's just like, dozens of inches of water dumped at one time, or that kind of thing. No, but there's inches being dumped at a time, and so that can become a problem. Water can overwhelm, it can sort of create get into your house. It can create horrible situations in terms of health. Standing water, think about mosquitoes and diseases like that, or even the dankness of mold and the kind of really persistent, really bad problems that mold can create. I bet John Brisson actually knows a lot about sort of the negative effects of mold on the human biology and the digestive system and all of that. So that's all, but meanwhile you gotta catch the water, you gotta use the water, especially if you want to like grow food, you want to have crops, or you want to take care of livestock. You got to have water. So you got to figure out how to then capture the water in the landscape if you're trying to use it for that. But it also can clean, right? It can clear. It can, I'm thinking back into LA, like when I was growing up in LA in the 90s and going to a school out in the San Fernando Valley, and we would be running laps, and so bad, the feeling of like the smog in your lungs, and breathing deep, it almost felt like there was like chlorine in your lungs, where you take a deep breath and at the very like end of it, you can feel like this really deep irritation. But I remember like after like rain days, how clear it would be. And actually Los Angeles air has gotten a lot clearer over the last, 20 years, something like that. But rain days in LA, which are sort of few and far between, creates a really beautiful atmosphere. So even the sort of cleansing of air, of water. And so water, can be connected to things like sadness or grief, maybe even, cry. You think about tears and all of that. So that's a long-winded roundabout. That was my own personal horseshoe, I guess, Greg, there, that you helped really form some really good stuff there. I appreciate that. So I'm going to play this quote from Bruce Lee. Let me see if we can hear this. Tell me if you can hear this. Wait, no, hold on. It's not working. Hold on.
Shapeless.
Oh, here we go.
Like water.
Oh, here he goes.
I said, empty your mind. Be formless, shapeless, like water. Now you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Now water can flow, or it can crash. Be water, my friend. Actually, you see, it's a combination of both. Here it is, the natural instinct, and here is control. You are to combine the two in harmony. Not if you have one to the extreme, you will be very unscientific. If you have another to the extreme, you become all of a sudden a mechanical man, no longer a human being. So it is a successful combination of both. The word superstar really turned me off, and I'll tell you why. Because the word star, man, is an illusion. It's something what the public calls you. You should look upon oneself as an actor. All type of knowledge ultimately means self-knowledge. So therefore, they're coming in and ask me to teach them not so much of how to defend themselves or how to do somebody in. Rather, they want to learn to express themselves through some movement, be it anger, be it determination, or whatsoever. To me, okay, to me,
I'm gonna let this play. It's just another
ultimately,
minute.
martial art means honestly expressing yourself. Now, it is very difficult to do. To express oneself honestly, not lying to oneself, and to express myself honestly. Now, that, my friend, is very hard to do, and you have to train. You have to keep your reflexes so that when you want it, it's there. When you want to move, you're moving. And when you move, you're determined to move. All the time, you are keeping the continuity going. Bending, stretching, everything. Suppose, you just keep it moving.
It's like a belly dancer there.
Yeah, it is. I mean, to them, you see, the idea is running water never grows stale.
Yeah.
So you got to just keep on flowing.
All right. Yeah, that sort of reminded me of that I did these different qualities of water that he's talking about, that it can flow, that it can sit in a cup, but it can also crash, it can bang, So I guess that's infused my mind when we were talking about the idea of the emotions of the moment and how then we can relate them to thought process and figuring things out, and then ultimately we might hope to attain wise wisdom, but more importantly, maybe wise action.
I guess my equivalent to that would be on this topic of emotion. I think this is going to fit into, I think where we're going to go with this conversation here during I guess probably the last portion of this live stream is my equivalent of that would be a quote from for the sports fans out there. The basketball coach Jim Valvano, who died of cancer, made a really stirring speech just prior to his death from cancer at the 1993 ESPY Awards, and this was a great quote from him. If you laugh, you think, and you cry, that's a heck of a day. You do that 7 days a week, you're going to have something special. And I think about that, and I think that's I think that's a wonderful quote, a wonderful piece of advice and a way to look at life. And I think, I certainly, well, I don't know if I cry 7 days a week, but I mean that's, if you have something to be that emotional and that passionate about in your life, and you could use that for a positive force, I think that is a very, very powerful thing. And so I think where we were going when we had this conversation, I don't know if you want to respond to that at all.
No, just keep going, Greg. I appreciate it.
What we wanted to go with our conversation, I think we had earlier that we wanted to bring into this conversation, is right now in this heat of this particular moment with, once again, the very emotional, very scarred history that it holds in this country, the topic of race becoming right at the very forefront of this already very emotionally driven division as far as state of our country, particularly in the Trump era, is that right now there's a very positive power to emotions, but I think there's also a very negative power to that. And I think in the process of this, while definitely our emotions can be used for the best reasons, like I think a lot of the best activism is done from people who are very, very emotional. I will contrast, for example, the very passionate, and doesn't mean by saying this that I always agree with it, but the very passionate, emotion-based activism of somebody like an Abby Martin. When she talks, when she does programs, you can always hear the power in her voice, the emotion in her voice, as opposed to the more just, I think, kind of almost cold and emotionless, at least in terms of tone, of say Amy Goodman in Democracy Now. So I think with the type of emotion
I resent that, Greg.
Yeah, but I contrast that because when you take the passion of somebody like Martin, who's clearly very, very passionate in everything she does, regardless of if you agree with her or not, and regardless of certain questions that we've had about her, that's one thing I've always really respected about her over the years. There's a power to that. I think, and a lot of the best activists, are the emotional types. You get a lot of the most powerful aspects of things, I think, are driven by emotion. I think that's very positive, particularly when you put it to activism or to a cause you're very passionate about. But at the same time, I also fear in this period of time that emotion-based responses can be negative in terms of what we've talked about here at the Antidote. We're not perfect at this. I mean, we're far from perfect. We're trying to get better all the time in this regard, though, is trying to maybe stay from getting so confined into certain ideological boxes that I think so many people, particularly in our sphere in the alternative media, I think have fallen into. And I think in a case like this really brings out our combination of some ideological boxes people might be in, as well, in combination of that and emotion. And I think what happens ultimately at a moment like this, you can just see the rhetoric and just how entrenched people are in their ways of thinking right now, particularly on this very emotional topics we talked about of race, and even bringing into that questions of patriotism and devotion to your country and love for your country, combined with a love and a passion for the institutions. And a couple of those institutions, of course, are the military, which is seen as being at the center of the whole flag controversy with people like Colin Kaepernick and now Drew Brees of the New Orleans Saints, who's come down on the side of not wanting to disrespect his country by the people who made sacrifices in the past, and also law enforcement, which of course is at the center of so much of this controversy with George Floyd, and a lot of other things, and reactions to protests and things of that nature. So it's very, very emotion-based reactions all around, and I think it's very important that we do not allow. Yes, control your emotions. Yes, display your emotions, but I think it's very important to not allow ourselves to get into this just very strong emotion-based response to the point that's very much mixed in with the very strong ideological reaction to things. And I think it's very important to try to stay out of a box that keeps us just looking at things emotionally, to the point that we do not just completely close ourselves off to anybody who might even have a perspective that's even slightly different from our perspectives on things. And I see that happening big time right now. Like, you either believe that lives are valuable or you don't, or you either love your country or you don't, or you're either a racist or you're not. And I'm seeing very little room for middle ground right now in the discourse, and even for an attempt to have a nuanced and rational conversation, a critical conversation. So I think that we really need to be mindful of these things, because I think it has a negative effect when you have these very strong emotion-based issues, that we be careful about how we respond to them.
Yes, and I was thinking about how I've seen quickly the rapid rise of the human versus subhuman. That this is not about black or white, or this is not about Democrats or Republicans, or this is not again about the police versus the civilians. This is about subhumans and humans, and people who are looting or doing violence are sort of then defined as subhuman, and basically sort of addressed basically as an it's interesting too, because then I then see this as basically a follow-up at some level to the eugenics undertone to COVID, basically, of and we'll readdress the question of COVID currently in upcoming, either maybe a show or a long form. But just even in putting aside the question of numbers and all of that, which I think there's a lot of weaponization and confusion around all of that. It's very difficult to get to the truth of the matter. But it was so obvious that there was a strong uprising current of a sort of eugenics kind of writing off people, whether it was elders or people in a weakened condition. It was well, they were going to die within the next few years anyways. Do we have to shut down the entire economy in order to save these people's lives for a couple years. That was sort of like the undertone to some of this stuff. So I'm seeing that now, a re-application of that kind of scenario coming up. But it's interesting too, like the question of like the way that symbols are playing, and then also, and as you just finished speaking, immediately I was like, oh, part of the issue too has to do with vision and how much video is available now, and how that all over social media you can find whatever kind of video that's going to trigger your emotions in a certain way. You can find dozens and dozens and dozens of them, and then you can decide to play them for yourself or for your audience, and so you can choose all kinds of routes of sort of triggering or addressing or focusing on certain kinds of visual incidents that have emotional content. And there's something about the visual that is intensely seeing, think about like a horror film. It's all about, sure, sound and plays into it, but it's really about the visuals, right? And so now we're in this hyper visual culture, and there's tons of video everywhere. And so I think that's also playing into it, almost like there's an imbalance. There's a positive side to having so much visuals, where stuff that could never have been captured before and being used for evidence, either of just sort of the public discourse sort or legal evidence, is available. I'm sure probably 25 years ago or 20 years ago or something like that, probably 25 years ago, if we had gone to this event at the Kansas City Public Library, there had been no record potentially of what actually happened. But because you had a high quality camera in your hands, then it wasn't just sort of like our word against the police's word, where they basically could just sort of say whatever. They'll go ahead and say whatever anyways, but it's video. You can play video in a courtroom, and I was not, in the courtroom during Steve Woolfolk, the librarian's trial, because I was a witness for his side. But I was told that when the video was played, the video that you took, Greg, on my camera, that it really sort of like already the whole prosecution and the private security and the detective from the Homeland, from the Fusion Center, both those guys trained in Israel, or it was actually sort of some kind of positively triggering vacation. It sounds like couldn't even get any details from during depositions from them about what actually happened. What did they learn? It was more like for the Detective Parsons, who worked in the Fusion Center, it was more like sort of triggering in a positive way his Christian Zionism of some sort, and he remembered the walls, and he remembered the sort of terrorists being over there and the sort of good guys over here, and so there was a wall dividing it and all of that. But they were on the stand giving their sort of thing, and then bam, the video goes on, and it changes the whole narrative. So there's obviously a really powerful thing of video. But when you get to all these sort of this replete triggering violent events, and first of all, people are confused about violence. I believe it's not the case that in property destruction is actually violence. Violence is actually hurting another being, hurting another person. And so, there's all kinds of questions about that in relationship to some people might say about animals and food and all of that. But we'll put that aside. But violence in a human domain is about one human hurting another human. Okay. Violence. Sometimes violence can be justified. Self-defense is violence, but it's justified. It's morally justified. And it's usually morally justified in relationship to the amount. It needs to be concomitant with the relationship of the threat, right? And that's also in just war theory, is all of those considerations, right? So there's that. But property destruction, obviously, it's if you go and destroy somebody's property, it's obviously a wrong against that person, right? I mean, you can imagine that there's similarly to violence, there's certain property destruction that can be directly morally justified, even if it's sort of like the destruction of someone's weapon that they're using to attack you or something like that. But I just wanted to point that out, that, that there's this sort of ongoing confusion between violence and property destruction. Both in this circumstance are negatives. We could discuss whatever, the background of some of that, the more complex background of things like the uprising of things like property destruction and violence, in a way not to try to justify something, but rather to maybe potentially understand it. Or we could also then figure out, okay, what are the inciting aspects of it? Is this sort of purely organic? Is this just sort of the relationship of the psychology of the mob? Is this opportunist? Is this negative elements, or some might call them subhumans, or whatever. There's all kinds of ways to sort of think about that. And maybe, thinking through in a complex fashion about how all of those kinds of things, what's the difference between a protest and a riot? Okay, what is the difference between peaceful protest and property destruction, then bringing in mob, violence or mob violence into it. And all those things have different psychologies and psychological dimensions, and they also potentially have maybe similarly architected histories, and then very likely some kind of synthetic aspects that are generating some of these outcomes, at least leading the way. And that was some of what we dealt with on our Monday radio show. Was, this is not a new thing. Go look back at this question of the Rodney King riot, LA riots, LA uprising as some call it. That this Reginald Denny moment of the white, the sort of like sweet white trucker working guy in the truck who just sort of didn't know what was going on and then gets pulled out of his truck. And I think I noted that in our show. It was like, it was on TV. It was on,
yes.
And similarly to Rodney King, where that was caught on video camera, and sort of like the big first moment for police brutality caught on video. And now we're sort of that, but maxed out. And we're that, and across the country is basically what we're seeing now. Everything's on video. Everything's in every city, in every state, basically. And so we're dealing with that. And then, so final point, and I'll pass it back over to you, is this question of, you brought up the question of the taking of the knee. And so things like symbols, and that's obviously a visual symbol. You don't say it, it's actually silent, right? So it doesn't play over radio. It doesn't play in writing, other than saying it. Well, at that point, everybody took the knee, but it's visually, sort of symbolically powerful when you see, when they, people are then sharing the videos of the police and the protesters taking the knee together. And then people are pointing out the hypocrisy of that, where, like, for example, this incident in Buffalo where the older gentleman, it looks like he actually has like a police helmet in his hand. It almost could be he's going to return it to the police, or he's, who knows what but he looks like he's going up to them. He's obviously no threat. And then he gets pushed over and hits his head and is basically knocked out and bleeding, it looks like. And then people pointed out that earlier that the guy on the police officer on the scene there had been kneeling with the protesters, and now we've seen that that after there was some I don't know if the immediate officers lost their job or whether it got suspended or what, but then I think 57 officers have now quit in protest against the policy of those police being disciplined and reprimanded for hurting this older guy, basically saying they're just, quote, doing their job, right? Okay. And then they also tried to say that this guy had tripped. So then now we're also then into this gaslighting era of where the video shows you exactly what happened, and yet still there's this official response. And I have noticed, like, that is one thing. There's a certain thing with police culture in the negative fashion of where it has devolved to. It's just intensely gaslighting and basically sort of maddeningly so. And it's almost like a tactic to basically be like, just tell you what they want you to accept.
it's very interesting dynamic in the, I don't want to talk out of tune, out of place here as being neither a military veteran or involved in law enforcement in any capacity, but it does seem to me based on my based on my perspective on things and what I've seen is that there's a very powerful, I think, almost want to call it, basically, and talking with some, you hear this from a lot of anti-war veterans, there's a very psychologically powerful component in terms of a conditioning to a certain kind of culture when it comes to law enforcement and to military, which combined are, they are responsible for our security domestically in the case of law enforcement, and globally in terms of military. And there's a very entrenched culture within these career paths that I think is very powerful. In that, I think that could explain in large part of something like this reaction of these officers in Buffalo. And I'd say it's probably a combination of this large, I think, the psychological, I don't know if I call it indoctrination, something of that along those lines. And then also a combination of feeling victimized because there's a media narrative out there that makes, I think, law enforcement officers believe, and to some extent it's legitimate, but it's belief that like there's just a massive conspiracy, against law enforcement officers and media and whatever forces are at play are just trying to make people hate the police and all this and that. So there's a very powerful psychological component as far as I think the indoctrination of these types of cultures. Perhaps somebody like Pat Tillman, if he had survived, instead of dying in a quote friendly fire incident months after he started speaking out about the you know why, realizing that the U.S. had no business basically being in Afghanistan and that we were lied to about the quote war on terror. Perhaps somebody like him could have spoken out about this in a very powerful way, but unfortunately we will never know since Tillman is no longer with us as of 2004. But I do think there is this powerful component to this that very psychological, very, and that also triggers your emotions as far as your feelings of patriotism and the belief that you're serving and protecting. And I'll throw out there, Jeremy, one more very powerful emotional image, and that is the image of the man who is currently, for better or for worse, I'd argue for worse, in charge of certainly our military, but also in charge of, he's seen as as this heroic figure by so much of our law enforcement, I believe, and that is the current president, Donald Trump, at the outside of the church in D.C. just moments after Attorney General Barr had ordered the Lafayette Park dispersed of protesters. The symbolic image of Donald Trump holding up the Bible, holding it backwards, but that is one of the most, I would say, for a certain sector of the population, one of the most powerful emotional images of this entire saga. So I had to throw that in there if we're going to be talking about pictures and videos causing emotional reactions.
Well, that's interesting, and that's because that actually just took place almost like very soon thereafter we finished recording our radio show on Monday, and that was such a serious moment. And and thinking back about this question of like the human versus subhuman discourse, the rising of that kind of discourse in certain circles, that I think that was seen as that kind of moment in a certain way. And there was certain things that were caught on film a few years ago of certain riot police talking about the protesters as cockroaches and like making them scatter. And then you think back about, about all the quotes from Israeli leadership in relationship to Palestinians as sort of, cockroaches.
I think the most famous one of those quotes would be, was it Menachem Begin who said, "A million Palestinians aren't worth one Israeli
fingernail.
Fingernail." Yeah, I think back to that quote.
Right, and so then then maybe even, who knows how deep he actually meant that in terms of, potentially supremacist, like, biological material. I could even imagine like that he might actually have believed that at a very, very deep and I would say sinister level, and that it wasn't just propaganda, although it served like that. So then that moment there where they're sort of clearing the protesters from Lafayette Park is seen by the supporters of it, I think, as like the clearing of these sort of dark cockroach sort of types to sort of clear the way for the, remember all these images of that were painted of Trump on the white horse, and that I don't know who did it, but that one that sort of paints him as like this sort of like, it almost looked like the way that the sort of new age gurus would talk about the white ascended masters in a certain way, of like the sort of young, sort of much more good looking Trump, and sort of making his way after Barr helped use law enforcement and I believe some support by National Guard to clear the cockroaches, and then here comes the white knight on the white horse to hold the Bible in front of the blighted church.
Jeremy, I have to pause for a second again. Please continue.
Okay. And so that was such a serious moment in the abuse of the Bible as an object. And you remember like Trump being asked about his favorite Bible verses, or even whether he was a New Testament or an Old Testament guy, and he's a both. I love them both. I love them both. I mean, so it's not clear that he's actually read the Bible. He apparently doesn't actually read much, and that's not a problem. But then to use a book that has that kind of spiritual power to it as a symbol, basically, in that kind of operation that is basically just sort of like a state-sponsored suppression of the key elements of the First Amendment. And there's been some arguments about whether there was any plastic bottles that were thrown at police in the moments before they decided to clear the area. But it's pretty clear that the decision was made in order to clear the area in order to make room for the photo op. And whether you believe like the current head of the Pentagon, Esper, who seemed to have gotten himself in trouble by trying to sort of save his own butt after the photo op by saying he didn't know that it was a photo op or exactly what they were going to do. That there was obviously, this was an idea that they had to do, and then they used the, state force to clear what was in almost, for sure, an almost totally like peaceful protest, as you would consider a peaceful protest. And that doesn't mean there wasn't tension or words being said between, from protesters to the police, but then sort of just take to that. And there were pastors also that were, had violence used against them to clear the area for Trump to go use the Bible. It's obviously sacrilegious, that kind of political usage of the
2 Corinthians, Jeremy.
Object.
2 Corinthians.
What's 2 Corinthians, Greg?
Right, that's Trump's understanding of the Bible, is he doesn't even know like.
But I don't know 2 Corinthians. I'm ignorant too.
Well, that's referring to the second book of Corinthians, which was one of the books that Paul wrote in the New Testament. But I mean, the fact that Trump.
But what's in it?
That's a good question. Can't quite. I mean, I myself can't quite give you the specifics of what's in it. It's been a while since I've read it. But the fact that Trump, talking about touting his Christian credentials, can't even properly name off the name of a book of the New Testament. I mean, kind of says a lot, I think.
No, and couldn't decide whether he's an Old Testament or a New Testament guy as a Christian, supposedly, right? I mean, like if you're a Christian, you're a New Testament guy, right? I mean, that's sort of the thing, right? It's not that you're, there's some Christians have different relationships with the Old Testament, but if you're a Christian, you're a New Testament guy, really. I mean, that's that's where the gospel is. And so we've talked a little bit about this background of Trump's relationship to his, apparent 33rd degree Mason, neuro-linguistic programming, sort of prosperity gospel type pastor that he grew up with. Do you remember his name?
Norman
Greg?
Vincent Peale, The Power of Positive Thinking.
There you go. So positivity, right? So there's, obviously that's a key piece that Trump uses, and you could use positive thinking in positive ways, right? Of course, like even neuro-linguistic programming. I don't know that much about it, but it looks like it's basically a way of introducing powerful phrases in an internal landscape to basically train your mind in a certain
And our
way.
friend John Brisson, we've read the documents. I think could fill in a lot of this conversation a lot better than we can. Hence the reason I brought him on our channel a couple of months ago to discuss a lot of these issues relating to Christianity, and I think a lot of the weaponizing and bastardization of it. People like Donald Trump's spiritual mentor is a younger man, Norman Vincent Peale, combined with his quote unquote spiritual mentors as the president, the people who promise the evangelical population that Trump is one of them and is really born again. And people like Trump's main spiritual advisor, Paula White of the prosperity gospel. God is mixed in with this idea of Christian Zionism, this combination of God just wants you to be wealthy on earth and have as much money and riches as possible. If only you give your tithes to an offering to the to the church, and then a combination of that and this whole apocalyptic end times prophecies with Israel and God's chosen people and all this and that. So Trump's getting like the best of both worlds with that, and so it's very interesting. But I just to make that point, John Brisson is very strong in these matters, and so I would recommend people maybe go over to his channel and check out some of the conversations he's had on this topic. A rare, nuanced perspective from somebody who is a very very passionate about his faith, but he's able to look at these things critically and with nuance. So I would recommend that. But Trump has just got like the best of both worlds when it comes to this fake prosperity gospel. And I think even people who aren't believing Christians can identify that this is obviously a fake gospel, this idea of just storing up all this wealth on earth combined with this apocalyptic belief in the nation of Israel and God's chosen people, and the combination of why we need to wage perpetual war in the Middle East combined with it's basically scaring people into believing that if they're not godly enough, that they're going to be condemned to hell and or to some type of pre-apocalyptic nightmarish scenario with the Antichrist.
And I have found that like people who are the most actually deeply committed in terms of their faith and the most serious spiritually are often not what we might see as like fundamentalists in the way that we think about it. Not necessarily like that because there's actually a whole fundamentalist is usually the fair way to think about it is someone who pays close attention to the text, so scripture in case of Christianity and tradition, right? So but the way that it's been patterned, the way that we think about it is that someone who's sort of like stuck in a certain, they have a self-guarantee of their own correctness about doctrine of some sort, okay? So I do think that it's interesting that like people who are really, really serious spiritually committed people and people of faith are very often much more ecumenical, not in terms of their practice, but in terms of their ability to be open to understanding, And so, when you think about Trump, on the other hand, you have someone who's the opposite of deeply spiritual, is what it looks like to me. I mean, I don't have much hint of an actual serious inner life at all, really. And that includes things like, not reading because, okay, beyond the question of like people who can't read because they never learned to read, if someone who sort of like rejects reading, I think that's what Trump is. He sort of rejects reading. To me, like reading is like there's something self-reflective about the relationship of you to the text. And there's sort of something very thoughtful. Sure, you could read nonfiction and get sort of caught up in the story, almost get outside of yourself. But especially when you deal with like scripture or religious texts, or even just sort of plain nonfiction, there's an aspect of it that involves self-awareness and self-reflection just in the process, right? You sort of pause and think about something, and then often you think about, well, what does that mean about me, or how do I relate to that? And you don't see that. There's no evidence of that with Trump, for example. And so it looks like what he did with this whole thing of the power of positive thinking was he basically applied it in a way to sort of PR. And that's what it looks like you get with him. Everything is sort of like, he combined his power of PR and personality, which is really sort of, that's Trump's power. He's a really good marketing guy. He'll tell you what you want to hear. He has a personality like no other. He has, sort of an image, even just his hair, like, he has good marketing. He has maybe even iconoclastic style marketing. But also, he doesn't deliver. That's also the thing partially about it, right? Because he's the man of bankruptcy. He's the bankruptcy guy. And, people, he even is able to use that as part of his PR, as basically, look, I'm the guy who knows how to work the system like you wish you knew how to do. So don't be angry with me. Follow me, because I can show you how to get over on the system and, go bankrupt a series of times and have it not affect my personal money at all. And I'll show you how to, shift your debts from the, Gambinos or whatever Italian mafia family, all the way on over and up to the Russian Jewish mob eventually.
It's very interesting because Trump's comments about, or Trump's 2 Corinthians quote came from a speech he made at Liberty University, that being the University of Jerry Falwell, and currently in the hands of Jerry Falwell Jr. In January 2016. And then, very interestingly enough, that whole thing I don't think was the greatest image as far as like endorsement of like Donald Trump as this sincere, God-fearing, Bible-believing Christian man of Christ. But then, within about a week and a half of that whole scenario is Jerry Falwell Jr. coming out and endorsing Donald Trump, which was, I think, the first of the big evangelical endorsements, which would then end up showing up in the months to come when it became obvious that Ted Cruz wasn't going to be the nominee. And then with the takeover of the Domestic Council for National Policy, Dominionist aspect of things, combined with the obvious Zionist Breitbart, as you called it, Death Star empire, all coming around and basically taking over the Trump campaign. But let's remember the questions of even in that regard of Trump and possible spiritual blackmail and not being perpetrated upon the Christian population when it comes to Trump. Think about the fact of the questions that came out about the role of possibly of Michael Cohen in ensuring Jerry Falwell Jr.'s endorsement of Trump with information about him. So that's very interesting.
Pool boy, wasn't there some pool boy involved with that potentially?
Yes, I believe so. Yes, I'm pulling up the information right now. I wanted to go back to that, and so I'm pulling that up right now.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, that was one of the earliest things that we sort of grokked about the Trump moment, was that it was at its deepest aspect in relationship to the people.
Tell me if you see this screen I share here. Just
sort of caught into supporting him. Yes, I'm going to move this stuff.
Trump fixer Cohen says he helped Falwell handle racy photos. So, months before evangelical leader Jerry Falwell Jr.'s game-changing presidential endorsement of Trump, Falwell asked Trump fixer Michael Cohen for a personal favor. Cohen said in a recorded conversation reviewed by Reuters. So, this is the link here from Reuters regarding what happened with Falwell and Cohen. The Falwells wanted to keep a bunch of personal photographs, from becoming public, Cohen told Arnold. That's Tom Arnold. I actually have one of the photos, he said, without going into specifics. It's terrible. Cohen would later prove successful in another matter involving Falwell. 2 people familiar with the matter told Reuters. Cohen helped persuade Falwell to issue his endorsement of Trump's presidential candidacy at a critical moment, they said, just before the Iowa caucuses. Falwell subsequently barnstormed with Trump and vouched for the candidate's Christian virtues. So that's very interesting, in that you think about Falwell endorsing Trump before pretty much the rest of the evangelical establishment did. And so from that question, regardless, Jerry Falwell has a right to a fair hearing as far as to the validity of these of what may or may not have happened. But on that aspect, it is very interesting that you have this whole dynamic of Cohen seemingly holding information over Falwell for several months that leads to Falwell coming out at a very crucial time in a primary process, endorsing Donald Trump right at this critical moment. And it did not result in Trump winning Iowa, but it ultimately resulted in, I think, a lot of people very easily making that shift, that transition from Ted Cruz, who was the favored candidate of much of the evangelical establishment, to Donald Trump. So
Yeah, and so that aspect of it was not only political, but it was spiritual, and it played. There was an aspect that where Trump was sold to the religious right in a combination of sort of their issue politics, but then also in relationship to some kind of aspect of like spiritual narcissism, I think, of like a reflection of yourself, and that he's going to reflect everything that you believe that you are. And yet underneath it all is, and this is going back to this question of the way that he evolved the positive thinking into basically PR, that it's basically a lot of promises that or he's always telling you how good he's doing for you, but the evidence is not really ever much there. So and that's sort of the proof of the pudding is this history of the bankruptcies, right? And when you actually get down to it in terms of the economy is so good or those kinds of things, go look at serious analyses of the actual statistics of the economy beyond questionable statistics that were reasonably being properly questioned under the Obama administration about unemployment rates. But then looking and then basically basing the whole thing on the stock market at some level. So it was like a sort of like a spiritual bait and switch of like you want a sort of, some guy who's being marketed as some kind of guy who's going to stand up for the Christians. And what you really got was like the sort of palest form of the prosperity gospel in the form of like the, Wall Street on steroids, really. And the golden calf, like, I mean, the gold of all, everything's in gold, right? So it's sort of, there's a golden calf thing that's sort of plain to see for the people with eyes. But, okay, this moment now, it's such a serious moment. There is just so much danger surrounding it on all fronts. But, de Blasio is using his coronavirus powers to enforce the curfews in New York City. So, and then the questions of then what's going to probably come after this in relationship to the question of contact tracing, health surveillance, that's all going to get ramped up. We're then also then dealing, of course, with this question of the use of military domestically. And they were definitely deployed, big old cargo, military, U.S. military cargo aircraft, with lots of soldiers in there coming in, being brought into D.C., for example. Supposedly, I don't know if it was the D.C. mayor or someone, potentially utilized some aspect of the Third Amendment. And we discussed the Third Amendment in one of our on sites in Kansas City when we dealt with the Bill of Rights. I talked about how my wife has really done a lot of explanatory work around that when we've been having conversations about how everyone skips over the Third Amendment. Everyone knows the First, Second, and Fourth, but the Third is actually the precursor to the Fourth, and that says that you can't have, and especially in peacetime, you can't have military forced on you, quartered in your home. And I believe that there was some aspect of that was used to refuse access of the U.S. military to D.C. in relationship to being quartered at a hotel. I believe that's the case. But this is really, really a crucial piece that I would urge people to look into, this Third Amendment question, because it not only obviously should apply to American military being sort of forced. People always talk about posse comitatus, but there's, posse comitatus, I believe, can be surpassed in relationship to the invocation of the insurrection law, which is what Trump was, saying.
Yes, and that's why it's so important to to lay out the groundwork and foundation of declaring an organization such as Antifa, regardless of what the actual Antifa role is in the chaos of the past week and a half. And that's something that I think almost by design we're not supposed to quite be able to make sense of by design, exactly what the role is of these of what's going on with something like that. But that's why it's so important for Trump and his administration, and a lot of the sycophants, people like Tom Cotton and others, to push the whole hard this idea that this is a domestic terrorist threat, which basically makes it easier to justify things like a massive military presence in our streets and over our skies as the pretext that you're no longer fighting. And you made the point, I think, the other day, you're no longer fighting your fellow citizens, but a hostile adversary. Basically, you're fighting a wartime enemy, basically. So
Yeah, I mean it's all in line with the treason. It's a treasonous framework. It is a totally treasonous framework. This post 9/11 so-called Homeland Security framework, domestic terrorists, enemy combatants, all of that sort of framework, in the setting up of Guantanamo, the whole thing being done not as actual war but as executive action, the entire planet as the battlefield, endless in time and space. And this is this sort of most recent invocation of the Antifa boogeyman is just one more piece of the treasonous framework of the war on terror. And it's not even true, really. I mean, like, sure, okay, does Antifa organize out of some bookshop in Portland? Sure. Do they teach people? And of course, as you can see, here comes Project So-Called
I was
Veritas.
just about to mention that.
Bring it up. Tell them. Bring them up. Yeah.
Yeah, Project Veritas comes swooping in. And by the way, I have not seen their undercover videos yet, but quote unquote exposing Antifa. But once again, Project Veritas is right there at the right time to bring forth these narratives. And people who are on the right, if you don't think that like the other side is benefiting from the promotion of these Project Veritas videos, I think you're very heavily mistaken, because Scott Creighton, Church Dog 42 on YouTube, pointed out in one of his videos the correlation and the symmetry of how Project Veritas and CNN both at right about the same time put out separate, basically, attacks against Bernie Sanders, with Project Veritas coming out with this video of the alleged high-ranking Sanders staffer, Sanders campaign person, talking about how we're going to set Milwaukee on fire, the side of the DNC, if Sanders doesn't win this nomination. And then CNN coming out with the Elizabeth Warren quip about Sanders being sexist and anti-woman. So, I mean, I think very much in a lot of cases, Project Veritas works in correlation with not just the conservative media, but with whatever the bigger narrative is to advance, I think, a lot of narratives going around. And so I think, you have to look at Project Veritas coming out with this on Antifa. This is very much, regardless of what the motivations are, or regardless of what kind of truthful information there is in there. And I'm not just going to say everything they put out is just false. That's not fair, because that's not the case. But there's definitely, you better look at this from a perspective of this is part of a bigger propaganda operation at play here. And this is not just a good-natured attempt to try to expose the bad guys in our midst here in the country. Once again, go back to the whole James O'Keefe publicity stunt from the summer of 2014, where he attempted to cross the border dressed as Osama bin Laden to show how easy it is for anyone to just cross our porous border security. So,
yeah, it's sort of like the BS truth, quote unquote, truth media for the Trump era. And of course, that's sort of like obviously they had their rise with the Acorn and, that whole scenario. But really, like, it's like the Trump era is where they've come into their own. Project Veritas is the leading edge of like gotcha journalism, and I do then
the rise of the Death Star Breitbart. That was Andrew Breitbart, and also, of course, who we've talked about a lot on this program, Lee Stranahan from now with Sputnik. That was the rise of Breitbart in large part, Andrew Breitbart and the Breitbart Empire. The Death Stars, we called it, working with James O'Keefe to quote unquote expose things like Antifa and also the whole Shirley Sherrod Department of Agriculture scandal. So,
yeah, man, and you can sort of see that Project Veritas is sort of like the special forces of the Death Star at some level.
Well, that's
right?
why Eric Prince was training members of Veritas, right?
At his ranch, but he said they were untrainable. They weren't going to make it, basically. Yeah.
So very
yeah.
interesting stuff, though.
But I think that their most recent one comes out perfect timing as Antifa is the sort of the sort of new generation of the Black Bloc. They're not quite Black Bloc they're more like sort of hardcore anarchists, I think, and they were basically, they were around obviously for they go way back, just like some aspect of what's called Antifa goes way back, but Antifa is not, as anarchists. They're much more, I think they're sort of, if their ideology is much more maybe mainline communist. I don't know exactly, but they're sort of, they're fairly recent in their rise at some level. But a lot of this can be explained. Their ideologies can be explained. I said in our show that I imagine, like, for example, this video by Project Veritas. It's like one of their guys who was a mole inside of the birthplace of Antifa, which is Portland, Oregon, the Rose City, and it's like in a bookshop, and they do some OPSEC and have you put your cell phone in the bathroom or something like that.
A major part of the Antifa narrative comes out of Portland, and the whole narrative pushed by people like AnteDote and other conservative activists that there were.
No, he's not quite conservative. He's sort of part of this fake right.
Well, he's in this whole apparatus, but very much backed up by like InfoWars and outlets like that, of the concrete filled milkshakes being thrown at the patriots by these evil Antifa anarchists. And look, I'll say this real quick, okay? I just want to make a point with Antifa is that, look, and this is not in any way, shape, or I shouldn't have to say this, but I'm saying it's not in any way, shape, or form like a downplaying of Antifa or any of these types of organizations. But just like with everything else, these need to be discussed with nuance. This current situation is not so simple as this whole broad conspiracy that George Soros, once again, there's the Soros boogeyman once again. George Soros is just pulling all the strings and funding all of these bad people to go out and just create violence and chaos and strife and all this. I mean, you've got to talk about this with nuance and with a sense of reason, because there's just, regardless of what Antifa actually is or is not, there has not been even a semblance of nuanced conversation about this, particularly coming from like this right-wing sphere that is supposedly exposing Antifa. There's not been even like the slightest semblance of a nuanced conversation coming out at all. And it also gives fodder for like the liberal elites to once again mock those crazy conspiracy theorists as just not living in reality. So we've got to talk about these things with nuance and with rationality, just like so many other issues. This is another one that is definitely not being discussed. And it's very dangerous because this whole rationale, this whole idea that Soros is just behind the scenes, just funding this massive destabilization movement going on in our streets right now, is laying the groundwork to allow someone like Donald Trump potentially to put the military in our streets on a very, very large scale in the future. So be very careful about pushing this narrative and just believing these things as absolute fact without trying to look at it from any type of nuance or critical lens.
Yeah, I mean, these are largely sort of, I would say, manufactured and largely fraudulent talking points that are designed in a similar fashion that a lot of the public propaganda surrounding 2016 was manufactured and individually delivered for certain groups of people. But this is even more blunt in a certain way. So anybody who is just sort of straight up marketing that this is all like, being caused by either Antifa on one hand or the 3%ers or the white supremacists on the other hand is not being fully honest about the depths and the commanding heights, I would say, of the situation if you really wanted to figure out what's going on. It doesn't mean that these groups don't exist or that, as sort of talked about, that, there is, and some of these philosophies, they should be actually dealt with directly. Like, what do boogaloos believed, sort of from a sort of libertarian style accelerationist aspect, or sort of revolutionary reformist libertarian perspective. 3%ers, they believe something different. Antifa believes something different. Black Lives Matter believes something different, right? Okay, so it doesn't mean that these are not real potentially, in terms of, at the very least, in terms of having somewhat coherent ideologies that can actually be understood. beyond just sort of like fear mongering that they're the boogeyman that's the real cause of all of this chaos or something like that. So, but it's obvious that this sort of the like you're saying, there's a danger here in terms of the rhetoric, and obviously it's not just rhetoric. Like the with the escalation of this into basically potential executive action in relationship to a treasonous, fraudulent war on terror,
Yes.
where you then have people then repeat, and of course this all fits in with what's been marketed around QAnon and the re-celebration of Guantanamo, as long as it has the sort of demon rats that are
By the
properly
way,
installed in
let's
there.
talk about the coming together of, I guess, talking points between like the hardcore QAnon proponents and then some of the most hardline, pro-Israel hardliners. Now that you've got both QAnon proponents and Noah Pollack, the executive director of the Emergency Committee for Israel, coming out and saying that we need to send these Antifa. I mentioned this on our show Monday, but the need to send these Antifa, these green-haired, freaks with nose rings and all this to Guantanamo Bay, much like we did after September 11th, with the symbolic image on his Twitter feed of American military personnel standing over suspected terrorists who are kneeling down. So
yeah, and in his description, not only is he apparently closely connected to Barbara Ladine, key figure in all of this stuff in terms of Senate.
Another common connection to the hero of the Q movement, Michael Flynn. I might
Michael
add.
Flynn, exactly, but also openly states that on his profile that Israeli lived in Israel, Israeli centric, and so it's very possible in terms of what we know about what Breitbart is. Breitbart's not just some sort of grassroots pro-Israeli organ. No, they were formed at the table with the guy who, of anybody in the entire world in relationship to the Zionist sphere, Israeli government, who could credibly be accused, I'd say, of being at the epicenter of a lot of any sort of deep state Israeli operations, most prominently September 11th. It's Benjamin Netanyahu, and that's where Breitbart is formed, is there at the table with Benjamin Netanyahu. So this guy, Polak, is that how you say it, or did I just
I think it's Noah Pollack. It's very similar to Joel Pollack, I think.
I wasn't trying to do Polish smears. I actually I had some part of my Jewish family's from Poland, obviously. Yeah. So so that the fact he's probably much closer to the 9/11 terrorists than any of the green-haired people from Portland, obviously I would say, but I am not saying round up the guy, the Twitter guys who are close to Breitbart and, send them to Guantanamo. No, I think we should restore due process and rule of law.
Yeah.
Not double down on treasonous, undermining, seditious architectures.
And on that note, the same people who sold us the fake war on terror are at the forefront of selling us on this idea of Antifa domestic terrorists, and we must fight them, and we must put the military in the streets to counter them if necessary, and Trump has to take the gloves off and deal with them like terrorists and not like citizens. Very much it's that same crew. I mean, you can look at Tom Cotton as obviously in so many ways being so close to Bill Kristol, but also very, very close to this other wing of what we've called the neocon split, as being an ideological successor to a lot of the big time active war on terror proponents. And of course, there's still that obvious factor of so many of the people who have been at the forefront of pushing so much of the propaganda for decades, going back to a very prominent member of the Pearl's Nest, as we called it. Of course, Frank Gaffney and his Center for Security Policy, very much at the forefront of trying to link together radical Islam and Antifa and lawlessness by, the Keith Ellison and Ilhan Omar up in Minneapolis and all this chaos being caused. So yeah, the people who are trying to sell you on Antifa as this irredeemable domestic terrorist group that must be snuffed out and dealt with the way we dealt with the terrorists in the Middle East, as Congressman Matt Gaetz tweeted out, when do we start dealing with Antifa like we deal with people in the Middle East? These are the people at the highest levels who from a propaganda perspective, definitely post-war, but also pre-war as well, creating and putting the narrative in people's minds of the decades leading up to September 11th of the idea of the Islamic terrorist, the religious extremist terrorist, are at the forefront now of pushing this Antifa terrorist threat in a very similar vein as it was pushed domestically, as it was pushed both on a domestic scale and on an international scale, the idea of the imminent Muslim Islamic terrorist threat.
Yeah.
So, and I want to go back one more thing here. I think we are going to start to wrap up here pretty soon. But you mentioned one more thing I got to go back to is you mentioned the 3%ers, and I'll be honest, okay, my ignorance, I had never heard of the 3%ers until I saw a 3%er mentioned in this. I believe it was somewhere in Tennessee. One of the cities in Tennessee, was it Nashville, is being arrested in relation to property damage and other things going on there. I had not heard of 3%ers, and this is an example of me coming out and being honest about my ignorance. Is that I was initially, when I was trying to make sense of this, I was kind of lumping in the 3%ers and the Proud Boys all as being in one, when they do have very, in a lot of ways, differing goals. I think they come together at a certain level as far as like common interest, but there are at least stated and advocated for differing goals that these organizations have. So one of the things that we've talked about, remember, we went back to the conversation about Pizzagate, which has led to Pedogate, and putting it into your mind to this emotional based response that, your opponents, that being the opponents of Trump and MAGA, are not just opponents of his, but they're into things like, sacrificing children and all this and that, and really, and what that does is it dehumanizes your opponent, your enemy, real or perceived. And so you're seeing this once again with, on one hand, you're seeing this with Antifa. Anybody who has legitimate grievances as far as like, treatment of certain aspects of the population by law enforcement or other issues as well, they are dehumanized as, just by extension, as being part of this elaborate George Soros plot to destroy America from within. But then on the other side, there's also a dehumanization of, say, conservatives, that anybody who supports law enforcement for whatever reason, or supports or has maybe more conservative views even on matters related to things like race and society and the role of government in terms of making people's lives better, you're automatically dehumanized because of the narrative going around. In a very emotional based response, we go back to that once again, that you're all collectively just racists who just want to oppress and hurt people who don't look like you. So we're following, this is another example that this very emotional based response that I think takes away the ability to have nuance or critical correspondence. Once it's something it does, and we go back to this as related to a very powerful example that, as I mentioned before, was this whole Pizzagate narrative, which rose to this whole pedogate and the absurd idea of Donald Trump somehow trying to stop all these deep state abusers of children. It creates a dehumanizing of your enemies, real and perceived, and I'm seeing that rise up again right now in the way we look at the other side in relation to the current dynamic.
Yes, and so, okay, moving towards some type of conclusion here in terms of where we might need to focus. And so I would say, okay, we want to deal with origination or triggering events, right? And so that could go anywhere from September 11th as a triggering event, or in this case, the actual originating apparent murder. There's a lot of questions about what actually that was. And so that's one thing to deal with, right? That you could go to the geography there. You could deal with some of the Minneapolis aspects, or then you could also then deal with what is the originating aspect or the triggering event in relationship to the sort of the violence and the looting and the property destruction aspect, the chaos aspect of this, right? Rather than the sort of protest, focused on specific aspects of dealing with a question of policing and where we've allowed policing to go in this country in some intersection with relationship to racial relations. Okay. And so that is a question that has been posed, that's on the table, that whether or not the originating event or, the originating groups are all the way for real or whatever, these are questions that are being posed that people of good faith are dealing with, and that I believe there are some actual potential good ends that we could figure out, and that there are some potential proposals for how to deal with some stuff. At the same time, then we might want to actually deal with, okay, what is the instigating force? What are the real serious instigating forces here? And so then I would just, have people look back to our Monday radio show where, I was like questioning, okay, Antifa. Is it it's probably the case that Antifa is like the Communist Party in the 1970s in the United States, where it's riddled with agents, if it's not a provocateur organization from the get-go at some level. Okay, so that's a possibility. But looking at the 1991 Los Angeles riots / uprising, how people want to look at it, it's so obvious there that there was these deep state operations going on. And they often will run out of these very secretive sort of police intelligence units, LA being a sort of severe example, right? The location we've talked about a lot, about the assassination of Robert Kennedy in the Ambassador Hotel, that was all had to have been, covered up and basically probably run in relationship to the fixed point of some aspect of deep state, police intelligence aspect. And then post 9/11, and I pointed this out before, that the first fusion center is apparently set up by Bratton, former New York police commissioner, former head of Kroll, maybe still head of Kroll, I'm not sure, in Los Angeles. And so there's this post 9/11 harmonization, that the way they called it, basically, where there's a further integration of these local units, especially police intelligence units, into the Homeland Security Network on up through the intelligence aspects of the federal government. And if you deal with, of course, New York, that obviously is like a heavily Israeli intelligence, and they brag on it, and New York police brag about how they have an office in Israel, and so that's very, very obvious. So I think that that's the level at which people might want to look at the instigation of all of this, right? Who's staging the bricks, right? Is this really Antifa and George Soros who are staging the bricks potentially? I sort of doubt it. And where is the investigative journalism? Like, apparently the Kansas City police found on the night where they started, tear gassing people in the streets. Basically a war crime, right? If it were done in a war zone, had found that there were bricks being staged all around the plaza in Kansas City. Where are those coming from? Who is staging that, right? So that's definitely something to look into, and to assess this in a similar fashion to maybe the way that we might assess something like 1991 and Rodney King and Reginald Denny, and the Reginald Denny attack itself as apparently being run via the intelligence assets inside of the black street gangs, right? And that is, and these are assets that apparently have gotten off the hook over and over again for some of their potential work for these networks. Okay, so that is the level of analysis that probably needs to be done in terms of figuring out what's going on and exposing it. People might want to look back again at this question of the truck that went towards the demonstrators on the I-35 bridge in Minneapolis, and whatever happened with that. How did that happen? Was that really a mistake? What was going on there? Was there an intent to sort of maybe even set the driver up potentially for a Reginald Denny moment, and then some of the wiser, cooler heads in amongst the protesters actually prevented that from happening, delivered the driver over to police? Police then also, I guess, apparently pepper sprayed everybody too, even when they were delivering the guy over. So that then leads to then, okay, what is the serious question right now being posed around this intersection of policing and race. And yes, it's obvious that it's all of this is being triggered and being put forth in a way where it can be really polarized in a way, and during a time where we really nuanced thought should get us basically all on a page together at some level, right? Policing, the police culture, especially in relationship to post September 11th, and we need a truth, accountability, trials of some sort in relationship to who set this up post September 11th. We do know that JINSA, Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, then America, and the ADL and the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations have been the leaders in, making sure that command level staff of police agencies are going to Israel. We found out that, hundreds of Minneapolis area police were trained by Israelis in recent years. Apparently in crowd control kind of stuff, the kind of stuff that where you might even put a knee on somebody's neck or that kind of thing. So there's that aspect. There's the militarization aspect. I forget what the name of the policy is in the federal government where they give the police all of the military weapons that are not being used anymore. So those two are very, very serious, right? But all of that actually adds up to a problem of attitude and stance that I talked about before in relationship, especially around like Israeli training and mind state of occupation, which has a racial component to it, and people will say, well, a lot of times it's black officers on black civilians, or but that doesn't mean that there's not a racial component that then is engendered in relationship to a psychology of occupation, and it may not even be color per se.
Also, thinking earlier what we talked about possibly, and once again, I hope I'm not speaking out of place here, somebody who's never been involved in law enforcement, but it seems to me with this dynamic you have where there's this very powerful psychological component as far as like, indoctrination as to what you represent and who you are. You could also make a case that even like, non-Caucasian officers in blue, they look at certain people, certain sectors of the population that are not one of them differently than even like, you have to think about that too as an indoctrination. It's not even just a racial indoctrination, a psychological, philosophical indoctrination. But like when you're on that side of the fence, you are, I think I would be very likely believe, and there's perhaps some law enforcement whistleblowers who have talked about this, but that you do see the people you are serving, particularly those who you already, in many ways, either subtly, consciously, or subconsciously, have a stereotype put into your brain regarding what they represent and what these certain areas of town represent. And I do think that there's a component that even when you do have, non-Caucasian officers in non-Caucasian neighborhoods, you do have that mentality. And I think it doesn't just seep into the quote white officers. I think it probably has a role in officers of pretty much any creed or culture or color. So.
Yes, and this is the major issue that we're dealing with that's very big and very structural and is not going to just be dealt with just by protesting, the death of one person. And this is a unifying aspect amongst all people of good faith in the United States at this point. And it's not against individual police officers at all, actually. And in a certain way, it's like trying to, help save what you would call the good police officers. And really, just to be honest here, fully honest, in actuality, a good police officer, the mark of a good police officer is not one who acts appropriately in relationship to the public, just that, or is a nice guy. I've met a lot of nice guys, even like some of the people sort of surrounding the unlawful Kansas City arrest. There was some, even the guy Curley, like the detective Curley, who was like actually ended up sort of like doing the detaining us and really sort of initiating the arrest at some level. He's actually sort of like a nice guy, but he was went along with this thing without even answering basic questions from me. But my bigger point here is that a truly good police officer will expose the illegitimate and the criminal and the bad police officers. But not only that, they would also be working to reform the structures. And the structures are bad. The structures have grown bad. They've grown into an occupying mentality. So that is something that we really need to consider, this bigger picture here that is a highly unifying and legitimate policy question.
And this is important because what you're saying here I think is so accurate. And this is not okay, I'm not comparing law enforcement to any of these, okay? But you think about, you met a lot of very good, decent people in law enforcement. And I have too, through my job I knew quite a few off-duty police officers, and I got to know a few of them pretty well. I mean, very decent, very good human beings, with families, and most of these people, they just want to get home every night to their families. I mean, they don't go out looking to find people to arrest and hurt and all this and that. I mean, but you said that it doesn't mean that there's not problems in the profession. Okay, and I'm not comparing law enforcement once again to these, but I'll make that clear. But there's good people in, say, Scientology. I'm sure there were many good people who went down to Jonestown. Doesn't mean there weren't problems inherent within those particular organizations. And I would say the same is true within law enforcement. You meet a lot of good people in the profession, but it doesn't mean that there's not problems in there. And what you mentioned about the whistleblower, the people coming forth and exposing corruption, that's one of the things that this type of dynamic can do. If you have more officers going out and some of the officers who are showing solidarity with their communities, or I think of the video of this African-American celebrity that you showed me the other day, Kiki Palmer's her name, out in the streets at one of these protests, talking to the law enforcement officers, the militarized police, basically in their riot gear, telling them you should be marching with us. If you have more of those kind of moments, that's going to bring out the good and I think the real side of justice and honor in so many of these law enforcement officers that could be used to actually save their profession and make their lives and make their careers and jobs easier by exposing some of the needs for areas, the systematic issues, kind of also to an extent from a philosophical perspective, but also from a corruption perspective. As you talked about earlier with some of the officers involved in your arrest and the indoctrination in Israel and playing on their emotions and their combination of love of country with this idea of the Christian Zionism aspect of this. You have that dynamic at play. And so these good officers that you talked about, the ones who will actually honor their oath and will exposing some of the corruption inherent within these, maybe this moment will lead to more of that. You hope it would.
You would hope that. We can't count on it, though. And similarly,
it's something to be optimistic about, possibly.
Well, it's something that we want to seek, and we would urge those of good faith to do that. And even if there were to be that, it would be necessary but not sufficient to meeting our moment. Similarly to this question of protest and being out in the streets, and I neither disparage the question of protest nor do I overblow it, like turn it into some kind of golden calf, because really, to me, talked about this a little bit before. It's really the question of assembly, right? It's really, in certain ways, okay, religion, freedom of conscience is sort of like the key internal freedom, but assembly is the key external freedom, I would say, of the entire political system in many ways, which means that we have to have the right to be able to consider together. We need to come together to assemble, to actually have these serious political and policy conversations to get to the root of things. And yes, a lot of that is based upon the freedoms of speech, press, religion, association. But the question of assembly, what are we going to actually decide upon to do? So neither sort of internal whistleblowers from inside of these police structures, nor sort of questions of protest or communion between protesters and police in the moment, even though those are all really important, and the humanity of that is really the most important aspect, like you talked about the connection across the line in relationship to one's humanity. That's crucial, I would say, Greg, in terms of what you're talking about, especially in this moment where there are forces that would have us descend into chaos, total division, internal, political civil war of some sort. or we can assemble. That's sort of the decision here. So, but at the same time, there are these bigger policy considerations that are going to have to be decided, that are going to have to go way beyond questions of even all the people that are talking about defunding police departments. And there's some, moves in that direction. Los Angeles, big old police budget, well over $1 billion, I think, and they're talking about reallocating 100-something million or something like that. That's not going to do it. That's not even anything really serious, I don't think. And neither is the sort of DeRay McKesson sort of people who are going to say, oh, before they shoot, they have to warn, or, like really sort of like deck chairs on the Titanic kind of stuff. No, we get to really rethink the concept of policing. What are police? What is the noble and crucial piece of police? Everybody sort of knows, even people who are maybe like hardcore libertarians or anarchists understand that the sort of firefighters, there's some kind of public good there, right? And there's an unabashed, even if there's sort of like argument about how it should be funded, people are not angry with the firefighters, right? So there's a similar kind of question about what is the role that police do. And so this might actually be an area where you can have some kind of interesting political trade-off between the right and the left in relationship to the Second Amendment, because what's going to have to likely be acknowledged is that, and this will be, eventually we'll get there in relationship to the national security and the military question. There's a Switzerland question in terms of the question of who is ultimately has not only the responsibility, but the power, who has the right and the power to defend themselves. And of course, the police are sort of said that they're actually about public safety, but very rarely, just be honest, very rarely, if ever. I mean, sure, you can point to some instances where the presence of police actually stopped something dangerous, violent, bad from happening. It happens, right? And so those are good examples for the kind of instinct and kind of situations and kind of community commitments and individual commitments that we should encourage there to be more of, the willingness to intervene in a de-escalating or positive fashion. But I imagine that it's very probably outweighed by the amount of times that like where something could have been solved by a social worker, that someone then ends up in jail and someone doesn't have a father around, or it even escalates into violence. So really,
such a snowflake, Jeremy. LOL.
The serious legitimate function of police. Siri just turned on my phone. No, Siri. No.
Serious legitimate function of police. Check it out.
No, I'm not gonna. I'm trying to tell you, Siri. Okay, the serious legitimate function of police is as law enforcers after the fact. They're investigators, detectives, and this, and go even here in Lawrence, go speak with women around questions of investigations into rape. Okay. Even my wife told me that they had now come out that there was something over 10,000 unprocessed rape kits in Minneapolis Police Department. What the heck are they doing if they're not even processing that kind of serious material, in relationship to, law enforcement, right? Okay. I think, this is my proposal, is we basically de-emphasize, or basically sort of grandfather out this question of that police are going to actually are there to enforce the peace or there to stop crimes, except for the question of then they get highly trained in hardcore investigative work where they can then, after the fact, make sure that the most dangerous individuals, both in terms of threat to person and property, are fairly and duly processed via law and are, both punished and also made sure that they are not able to do those things to people in a way that can then be seen as, discouraging that kind of thing in the future. Okay, so that is something that we I think we need to consider. What is the actual functioning of police? But meanwhile, we have what you were talking about before, about the actual sort of the internal culture of the police, where they become, you know, they I almost call it police Zionism. It's what it really looks like at some level. They have the strongest unions. There's this sort of like revanchism that they have. The thin blue line is actually, it's the thin blue line is actually sort of seditious symbology to deface the flag, to put a dividing line in the flag, to color it differently.
Point.
What are they doing? That's obviously
a great point. I've never thought about that before. And law enforcement officers are I would imagine, some of the most passionate when it comes to, African American football players, quote, disrespecting the flags. That's a very interesting point you make there.
And my sense is that there is an aspect of sort of Zionism that is being pervasively deployed, whether it's sort of like, intentional or an architecture or not. It's very obvious to me in terms of the way that it was, that it was used in relationship to Jewish people, where there's this really strong sort of like, we're just in this for ourselves. No one's going to look out for us. They don't understand us. They are a perpetual threat. We need our own, sort of ability to secure our own, on up to a country in the case of Zionism and the Jewish state and all of that. But
and
that's
the slightest efforts to like even defund our massively, it seems like to me, over bloated some of these major cities, funding is all out effort to try to destroy our entire profession and the idea of law and order.
Right. And so then this is what we need to discourage, is this whole evolution, especially post 9/11, of the Israeli training, the training in psychology of occupation, the training in tactics of occupation, the militarization, and then this revanchist sort of, it's sort of chauvinistic too, approach to the group mentality, the group psychology, and how it's so wild how strong their unions are. They probably should not. They probably should have just a sort of more general public union of some sort, and rather than where there's a lot of, go look at the guy George Kroll, I think his name is, from Minneapolis, and his role. He's the head of the police union there, and his role in in a lot of what the building up of the bad inertia in relationship to the Minneapolis police. Bob Kroll, thank you.
Bob Kroll, actually, at a Trump rally in the fall of last year, Trump brought him onto stage to a massively applauding audience as the face of, law and order, in the face of all the criminality and thuggery. So there you go.
Yes. Okay. So I think that we have to think at this kind of scale, and so it's not going to be simplistic answers here, either from sort of like what are seen as sort of hardcore, like end all of the funding, and or the sort of milquetoast of the sort of Aspen Institute DeRay McKesson types, which just want to rearrange the chairs. There's real serious policy questions here, and I've seen actual analyses of the things, if you were not to even just sort of like fully rethink the concept of policing, or what services we want police to serve, and then who is then called to do so. Because it may be that if we were to push, police in the direction not of the question of, showing up to protect public safety or individuals, which is really, they almost always show up after the fact, and they will admit that, right? That's, so there could be this trade-off on the Second Amendment, where the right then is able to extract an agreement from the left about the crucial aspect of the Second Amendment in relationship to then saying, okay, police do not hold that function anymore, of trying to, that they're actually, the responsible to show up if your house is being burglarized or if there's some kind of violent act being done. No, you are responsible for that. Then maybe your neighbors or your community, or your, people who are there on the street with you or wherever. That we need to create a culture of protection, of security and protection in relationship in a mutual fashion with each other. And then the police then can become, this investigative calling. And some police are going to have to find other jobs. Okay, they will. We also have to rebuild manufacturing. So guys who like to sort of get in the action and beat protesters or whatever, they're sort of the action, those kind of action guys. They can do some other physical stuff where they actually build something and do something of value rather than attack First Amendment processes. Okay, so they're gonna have to find other jobs. Others, and these are actually some of the best police. They're thoughtful. They can smell bullshit. They are actually fairly diplomatic in a way. They can know how to speak with people, and they are actually the real sheepdogs, meaning that they want to go look and actually look for the truth about exposing the predators in the society and to hold the predators to account. So those are some of my thoughts about the actual questions around policing. That I don't think we have enough time to sort of get fully into the question of race. I just want to say that there is a deeper history here that people who either sort of just want to sort of simplify it or say that there's nothing there, that it's just African Americans getting whipped up into a frenzy. It's do a little more study, do a little more research about the evolution of police in this country out of slave patrols. There is that history. I imagine that even before, of course, this question of September 11th and the war on terror and the militarization and the Israeli training aspect, that's probably some deeper patterning structural component to the background of policing in this country. And then there's also the deeper questions of the issues of the way that the police were used to enforce economic aspects of their apartheid. We do have had economic apartheid in this country in many ways. The background of redlining. Kansas City itself has it's a sort of an epicenter of some of the leading edge policy of redlining against African American folks. And so go look into that. Even in the post World War II era, where like African American veterans who would hold down like two really good jobs and have just as good credit as their neighbor of European ancestry would not be able to deploy their wealth in even close to the same fashion. Certain neighborhoods would be off limits to them via banks, right? So, and then of course we then need to deal with this question of, okay, if there's a question of racism or racialism or some aspect of race, and then there's a question of whiteness, and I, of course, have said it over and over again that I'm suspicious of even the concept of the way that white and black have been deployed. Basically, that's obviously some kind of, chessboard. Is it a B'nai B'rith Masonic, Judeo-Masonic chessboard? Is it a, Scottish Rite Masonic chessboard, the black and the white? And so I still believe that white as a concept is actually a violence against the individuality of and lineage of a person of European descent. And so don't fall into the point of where, okay, you're going to be a pawn on some B'nai B'rith chessboard defending your white man status. No, dude, go deeper. The moment calls for a much deeper commitment to your own background, let's say, if you consider yourself, quote unquote, white. Okay. And that again then goes to quote unquote black, right? Okay. So that's one thing. But then, of course, if we then have to then get back into this question, if there's such a thing as white privilege, and there is, obviously in relationship to the way that economic and police structures have built up in relationship to racial dynamics. Obviously, driving while white is, in general, it's not as dangerous as driving while black in relationship to police. That's just that's a deal, okay? So the question is not then about saying let's then try to erase the question of white privilege, and that's just some sort of woke fantasy, and that's just an attack on white people, and then equating, questioning, how to use white privilege in a positive fashion is basically, saying that all white people are evil or white supremacists. No, there's a serious question there. Then the serious question we need to overlay then on top of that is the question of Jewish privilege, especially in relationship to these dynamics in this country, the background, some of it which we've really explored in relationship to the background of organizations like the so-called Anti-Defamation League relating to African American organizations for civil rights and their management of that. Obviously, if you're dealing with sort of like, finance in the United States of America, the background of the Jewish role in slavery, in African slavery, that's obviously in the structure here. Okay, so that's what I would say is that we then have to then additionally deal with the question of Jewish power, Jewish supremacism, and then Jewish privilege. And I do like to utilize Jewish privilege unabashedly when I see it as important to do or advantageous. For example, when I deployed it against Alan Dershowitz on C-SPAN, when I identify myself as a Jewish American patriot of conscience, I'm both being honest. I'm also being forthcoming in a journalistic fashion about my background, but I'm also deploying Jewish privilege to try to use it as a shield, a human shield.
By the way, argue that this would be the opposite kind of, say, maybe Jewish privilege that somebody like Seth Rogen, who is an unapologetic supporter of all things Israel, coming out in a big way on his social media feeds, basically yelling and shaming at anybody who, who writes a contradictory post on his Instagram page about Black Lives Matter, fuck you, shut up, racists go to hell. It's like an opposite kind of privilege from somebody who's such an avowed, Zionist supporter of Israel who turns a complete blind eye to like the treatment of, of darker skinned people in Israel. So it's like the opposite kind of Jewish privilege, I guess you could say, or of the very Zionist heavy Sumner Redstone owned Viacom company, putting out 8 minutes and 42 of silence and a breath going over the screen with the words "I can't breathe" written across the screen. So it's an opposite kind of, I'd say, privilege than these types of what I would say are very hypocritical shows of what you might call Jewish privilege in that regard.
Well, and it's the same structure as the legitimate aspects of the question surrounding what's called white privilege, meaning that it's not saying that it's not attacking, it's there, people who talk about white privilege are not blaming, it's people who understand it, and when they're actually talking about it in a serious fashion, they're not blaming. They're not saying white people are evil because they have white privilege. They're saying there's these structural dynamics because of the historical facts of our situation, and in different ways we can understand that certain groups of people have certain aspects of privilege in relationship to certain things. Okay, and then it's a question of, well, what do you do with that? So you could then you could then do with your Jewish privilege basically to try to then shift everything off onto quote unquote the whites, right? All right. And so then this again is and then indication of a question of collectivization. We want to resist collectivizing people, right? We want to be able to talk about groups of people, backgrounds, all of that without collectivizing people, such as using these kinds of terms, whether the whites, the blacks, the Jews, the Muslims, these kinds of terms, they're shorthand, basically a way of sort of like saying a fast way of describing a big group of people or a complicated situation. But in general, they serve the purpose of collectivizing people rather than being actually sort of specific and nuanced in what you're actually talking about. Okay, so I just wanted to, because that just came up in the way that I was speaking about that, so I wanted to just address that. But then the question is, then how do you deploy your privilege? And how do you also recognize the factual circumstances in relationship to the big structures of things that we might talk about in relationship to politics or race or economics, right? These kinds of things. There are big, big structures to understand that go way beyond, is this individual person, in society or police officer, quote unquote, a racist or not. Okay. And so that's the type of stuff that needs to be looked at. And so I do think we should deploy not only the terminology of the question of Jewish privilege, and I've advocated for that. I think that's a really key thing to begin talking about. It obviously exists in a serious and obviously fairly covert fashion at some level. So that needs to be articulated into coherence and light. So then it can be then decided whether you're going to use it to basically sort of, smash the evil white racists on your Instagram feed as Seth Rogen, as a supporter of the supremacist, with your full Jewish privilege on site against the Palestinians, if you're Seth Rogen, I guess, or whether you're going to actually use it to deploy to defend other people from the attacks in relationship to Jewish power. Right.
And even to be fair to say someone like Seth Rogen, for example, there could be a true believer aspect in him that is like very much has his own like psychological conditioning going on, being a Jewish person and believing in the spirit of persecution. I don't know if that's the case or not, but I mean, there is that aspect as well that might be working on psychologically with regards to even somebody as big of a celebrity as him when it comes to his own idea of what Jewish identity is, similarly to the other psychological dynamics. I don't know, but we have to consider that at play. But at the same time, it's also not really an excuse to continue to have this type of mentality out there if that's the case.
Well, I think it's exactly that. And that's usually the way that something like privilege, when it's not actually being grappled with or deployed in a conscious fashion, it's usually unconscious. And then there's some sort of resentment or anger or some sort of internal revanchism in relationship to then admitting your privilege or something like that. So it is the case that it's often unconscious. And so that's why it's so important to then begin to deploy it so it becomes much more open. So people who are subconsciously expressing their privilege in a way that is maybe more destructive can then either grapple with it or then be exposed. Okay. And then you have the question of then how then to potentially positively deploy it. All right. All right. So that's another piece to that. But then, okay, finally, yes, deal with some of the history here in relationship to the question of the racism. Okay. Deal with the economics of it. Look at this question of the redlining, of how, for example, in this Kansas City context, how generations potentially of like African Americans who were trying to live what we know as the American dream were basically just subjected to an evisceration of their ability to deploy their earned wealth because of these structural questions. So that is, of course, then that all plays into economics, then culture, then you deal with the weaponized culture on top of that in relationship to drugs, the drug war, the cocaine, the crack cocaine, the marketing of that. That's the Iran-Contra crew, of course, all in there. Then you have hip hop, the takeover of hip hop culture.
And going back longer term history, I mean, outside of Kansas City, we just recently, as of about a week or so ago, May 31st and June 1st, the 99th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre, which was the district in Tulsa known as Black Wall Street, and the complete destruction that took place there. So that's another example from a longer term perspective, very real things we need to address. And I would also throw in there an incident that I think has caused a lot of anger at law enforcement, particularly in Philadelphia, which is where our friend Chris Rulon is from, the destruction of entire, at least one city block's worth of property via the Philadelphia police targeting members of what was known as the Move movement of African American activists in the Philadelphia area. So there's a couple of examples of history that I would guess myself personally as a Caucasian, I would maybe 2% maximum really have any, as far as like the average population. I don't want to be too generalizing here, but I would say very few uh, Caucasian Americans, especially over a certain age, really have any type of understanding or knowledge of these kind of events. One as far back as 1921 and the other more recent 1985 that have, I think, created a very justifiably frustrated at best and angry at worst reaction towards certain things in society. And so there are things that we need to deal with in our history that is and those are just two more examples I wanted to throw in there. The Tulsa massacre of 1921 of what was known as the Black Wall Street community, and then the Move bombings in Philadelphia in 1985.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, I guess we should probably call it a wrap tonight. And there's gonna be a lot more, a lot more to deal with. So we gotta stay focused. So hot times call for cool minds,
And
for
cooler
the
heads
cooler
to prevail.
and then thank you, Greg. And Greg has the antidote for cooler heads to prevail.
I sure hope so.
And in this, apparently the word cool, and I haven't checked this, but apparently the word cool comes from Yoruban, I think West African, I believe, meaning not like the cool guy in the club, but the guy who has a cool head under pressure, who has the most responsibility, the most disciplined responsibility for his people. Okay, that's the cool guy. All right, so that's what we mean by when we're talking about the cool. So that's what we aspire to, right? That's what we're working to aspire to, and so, well, Greg, I've enjoyed
Yes,
hanging
definitely.
out here.
Same here, and I hope to do this more often. And I'll just say, we're all growing here. I mean, none of us have all the answers, or even most of the answers. I mean, but we're all growing here, and I think it's very important to continue to expand our thinking, continue to learn more, and continue to, as we talked about with the overriding theme of emotions, who just continue to uh, try as hard as we can to continue to have the ability to try to think with nuance and think with a perspective that allows us to be open and not completely closed-minded to ideas that are not, entirely in line with what we perceive to think or believe. And I think this is very crucial. This aspect of what we've discussed tonight. And we're all human beings. I mean, we all let our emotions get to us, but it's a matter of, I think, trying to control that in terms of a constructive conversation for the greater good. And I think we're both, we make strides to try and do that, flawed as we may be. And I mean, we know each other very well. We know our emotions tend to get the best of us a lot of the time. And we've probably seen examples of that even in ways we've reacted to things on air. But, we're trying to do that. And so I just say, just if you get anything out of this, just try to please continue to keep, as much as you can in this very difficult time, a nuanced and rational perspective on things, rather than just allowing, emotions and spur of the moment type of thoughts to get the worst of us, I think, in a way that's very detrimental and counterproductive.
Well, thank you, Greg. And I definitely will work and aspire to deploy my Jewish privilege in productive ways in this time, and maybe not deploy emotions, but allow emotions of all qualities to become nutrients for wise thought and action. So let's see what
I said. Empty your mind. Be formless, shapeless, like water. Now you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Now water can flow or it can crash. Be water, my friend. Actually, you see, I mean, it's a combination of both. I mean, here it is, the natural instinct, and here is control. You are to combine the two in harmony. Not, if you have one to the extreme, you will be very unscientific. If you have another to the extreme, you become all of a sudden a mechanical man, no longer a human being. So it is a successful combination of both.
AnteDote. We out. Bye, Greg.
Oh, we're off now.